Chapter 43 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha FINLEY. Chapter 43. Turning State's Evidence. It was at Judy Flanagan's bedside Dr. Monteith was ministering that night. The poor old woman's injuries were very severe. Early in the evening she was walking up and down the grassy space in front of the cottage, extending from its garden fence to the road. She held the hand of a little toddling creature, and several of her older grandchildren were gambolling about her. Suddenly a wagon with 2 horses attached came tearing down the road, running away, for there was no one in the vehicle. Starting at the sound and sending a hasty glance from side to side to see that all her little flock was safe, Judy uttered a wild shriek, and letting go the babe's hand, made a dash into the middle of the road, where she had just perceived the next in age busily engaged in taking up handfuls of dust and throwing them into the air. She had barely time to snatch the child and toss it over on the grass out of harm's way, when the horses were upon her, trampling her with their iron hoofs and dragging the heavy wheels over her prostrate form. On they rushed, leaving the poor old lady lying there without motion or sign of life, and as Murphy and his wife, the latter uttering shrieks of grief and terror, were endeavouring to raise and bear it to the house, Dr. Monteith drove up in his gig. "Oh, doctor, doctor, it's me that's glad you've come, for me mother's killed entirely," screamed Katy, "and me heart's breaking wid grief. Oh, doctor, it's good and kind ye always are to the poor and suffering, and can't ye save me mother?" "Calm yourself, Mrs. Murphy, and I will do all I can," he said, stepping from the gig and giving his assistance in conveying the insensible form to the house, where they laid it on a bed. Katy followed, wringing her hands and wailing piteously. "Oh, me mother, she's killed, she's killed." "Hush, Katy, she's not dead, but you will help to kill her with your noise," said the doctor almost sternly, and she ceased her cries on the instant. Even while he spoke, he was beginning his examination into the extent of Judy's hurts. He found one leg broken, a number of bruises on the body, and a slight cut on the head, while there was reason to fear much more serious internal injury. It was some time before he was able to restore her to consciousness. Her head had been bound up, the broken limb set, and yet she lay as one dead. But at length she opened her eyes, gazed about her with a bewildered look, and putting her hand to her head, asked, "What's wrong, Katy? Where am I?" Then catching sight of the doctor, she started up with a piercing cry. "No, not him, not him. Send him away quick, Katy, afore he minds me old face," but fell back instantly, shuddering and covering her face with her hands. "It's just Dr. Monteith, mother," said Katy soothingly. "You know he's good to the poor, and can all but raise the dead, and he'll soon cure up your hurts that you got trying to save little Pat from being runned over." The doctor had scarcely seen Judy before she, having studiously avoided him whenever sickness among the other members of the family had brought him to the cottage. He was at a loss to understand her agitation at sight of him, but said kindly, "You must try to keep calm and quiet, my good woman. There is nothing worse for you at present than excitement." "Och, but it wasn't me as killed her. It wasn't me as told her the bad news. That was only a lie after all, but throwed the purty crathur into convulsions. Nor it wasn't me as carried off the babby and made believe the dead one was all. Me heart irked for yees when I see how yourn was like to break with the sorrow, and I had it on the end of me tongue to tell you the whole truth. But she, the old she-devil that she is, wouldn't let me," she groaned. Dr. Monteith started as though he had received a stab. A sudden paleness overspread his countenance, and he glanced inquiringly from one to another of the little group about the bed. "Her mind's wandering. She's gone clean out o' her head," muttered Katy, with a frightened look. "I'm not," said Judy, overhearing her, "and it's me as means to make a clean breast of it before I die." She was trembling violently. "Doctor, am I killed?" she asked in tones of affright. "You are very seriously injured," he replied gently, "but we will hope for the best. Yes, it may be that you have not long to live. Whatever you have to do should be done quickly. Is your soul at peace with God, my friend?" She shook her head with a bitter groan. "No, no, and it's me, Judy Flanagan, as can't die in peace till I've made a clean breast o' it till you. And Pat, it's you as must run for a lawyer to take down me evidence, or the doctor'll never get his own out of the hands of that old she-dragon." "Doctor, what was it he said? Haven't I the least bit o' a chance for life?" "I think you will live for several days," he said, "and there is a possibility that you may get up from this bed again, a possibility that will be greatly increased by relieving your mind if you have any weight upon it." "Then, doctor," she cried, catching his hand and looking eagerly into his face, "will yees promise not to send me to the penitentiary for what I'm going to tell yees?" There was scarce more color in his face than in hers, as he bent over her and said very low and with a slight tremor in his voice, but clearly and distinctly, "Tell me the truth, the whole truth, Judy, and that only, and you need fear nothing from me." "And will ye protect me from her?" she asked, glancing tearfully about the room. "I think I can promise that she shall not harm you, whoever she may be," he answered. "And now, Judy." Murphy and his wife looked pale and troubled, and an uneasy glance was exchanged between them. Judy saw it. "Don't ye be feared, Katy," she muttered. "Doctor, she and her man had nothing to do with it. It was just me and her, the old she-divil. Don't you mind me old face, Dr. Monteith? Have you forgot the old nurse as tended the beautiful lady at Avonmore up the North River, when she lay a dying, and ye comed home to find her too far gone to spake till yees? And have you forgot how she looked up at ye so beseechin' like wid her big black eyes? And haven't ye never wondered that her, as he calls your daughter, is like the very picture of your dead wife?" And she clutched his arm and looked fixedly into his face. "Yes, yes," he said hoarsely. Go on, if you have anything to tell. And ye'll not put me in jail if I get up again?" "No, no, you shall not suffer for your crime, if crime you have committed, shall not be persecuted, if only you will now make all the amends in your power." The doctor was becoming fearfully agitated, but controlled his feelings by a mighty effort of his iron will. "It wasn't me as iver had the last bit o' enmity till ye, doctor, or till the purty lady," Judy went on with a groan. "But Mrs. Craven, she'd been very good till me and the childer, and when she told me she'd been robbed o' her inheritance, and axed me if I could help her get it back, I didn't stop a minute to think, but just said, 'Yes, mum, wid all me heart I will.' But it never entered me mind the sort o' help she'd be after wanting of me. Try to tell your story as briefly as possible, for you have neither time nor strength to waste," said Dr. Monteith, as she paused for breath and lay back on her pillow, pale and exhausted. He held a spoon to her lips as she spoke. She swallowed the contents, and presently went on with her narrative, the substance of which we will give in our own words. Some years before the opening scenes of our story, Judy Flanagan had come over from Ireland to join her children, a son and 3 daughters, who had preceded her and settled in Philadelphia and its vicinity. She landed in New York, fell into the hands of sharpers, and was robbed of her little all. The letter written by a friend to apprise her children of her coming had never reached them. As a consequence, they did not meet their mother, and she, an ignorant woman and a stranger in a strange land, did not know how to find them. In the midst of her distress she met Mrs. Craven, the sister of Mr. Delacourt, in the street, told her pitiful tale, and asked for a little help in money and advice. The lady listened to her story, gave her what she needed, and sent a servant to see her safely in the cars. Judy was very grateful, and when Mrs. Craven came to her a few years afterwards, saying she wanted her assistance, she readily promised to do whatever was asked of her. Mrs. Craven then cautiously unfolded her plan. She wished to engage Judy as nurse to a young married lady, the adopted daughter of a brother of hers. She had already rented a small cottage in the vicinity of Avonmore, the country seat where her niece was living, and she wanted Judy to remove to it at once, bringing with her a widowed daughter and a grandson, a boy of 10 or 12. She would have use for all 3, she said, and would pay them liberally for their services. Judy asked what services she required besides the nursing of the lady, and in reply Mrs. Craven told her an artful tale concerning Mr. Delacourt's will, asserting that she had been foully wronged by Mrs. Monteith, who was a heretic, and would use the property in opposing the true church, while if she herself, really the lawful heir, could but get possession of it, she would endow churches and convents, and thus greatly advance the interests of the true faith. Judy, who was a bigoted Papist, listened eagerly, and felt ready to do almost anything to assist in the accomplishment of such ends. Having thus prepared the way, Mrs. Craven at length cautiously hinted at her intention to attempt the abduction of the expected heir of Avonmore, in order to secure the inheritance to herself in case of the death of Mrs. Monteith. Judy reluctantly consented to give her assistance in this, and their removal to the cottage was at once effected. After that she saw Mrs. Craven almost daily, and gradually their plans were matured. In order to success, they must manage to dispense with the presence of both husband and physician, which was no easy matter, as Mr. Monteith was devoted to his wife, and seldom left her for an hour. And besides this, there was an old aunt of his, who watched over them both with untiring affection, and who would prove quite as serious an obstacle as either of the others. "If I could only get them out of the way, even for a few hours," Mrs. Craven said again and again, "I could soon manage it. One need only run to her with a report of some terrible accident to him, and the thing would be done." At last chance seemed to favor them. One evening Mrs. Craven ran into the cottage in breathless haste to say that Mr. Monteith was to go to New York early the next morning, some very important business demanding his attention, and would not return till noon of the following day. He was to drive to the depot in the Avonmore carriage, taking with him a gentleman guest who expected to leave by the same train. And now she bade them all be prepared to act their parts in assisting her to carry out her scheme. Peter, Judy's grandson, was to watch the carriage to the depot, and as it started upon its return, rush out suddenly from the covert of some bushes on a steep hillside, and with a loud whoop frighten the horses and cause an upset. Then to run on to Avonmore with the news that Mr. Monteith had been thrown from the carriage and killed, which report Mrs. Craven was to take care should be heard by the young wife. She was also to get the aunt out of the way by means of lemonade drugged in a manner to produce excessive nausea and vomiting. "But how did you expect to account to the father for the disappearance of his child?" asked Dr. Monteith, interrupting Judy at this point in her narrative, and speaking in a voice almost choked with emotion. "We hoped 'twould be dead born, sir, as would be most likely when the mother was so frightened, and then we wouldn't need to put it out of the way, and if it was alive, there was a dead one we could have got to put in its place. The saints, or maybe 'twas the devil, favored us, and a woman that was beholden to Mrs. Craven had had a dead born baby that very morning." "Wretches! Murderers!" he exclaimed, burying his face in his hands, while his whole frame shook and trembled with the strength of his suppressed feelings. "Now mind your promise that no harm could come to me if I told ye the truth," cried Judy, again clutching his arm in terror. "I'll not tell ye's another word if you're going to have me took up for my part in it, for 'twas her more than me, she forced me into it, she did." Go on," he groaned. "You need have no fear that I will break my promise if you keep yours. Was it the dead child you have spoken of, that I was made to believe was my own?" "No, no, that was your own, doctor, as sure as I'm a living woman, and it died o' itself too. I'm an awful old sinner, but there's no blood on me hands, thank God, and the Blessed Virgin and the saints." Go on, you're torturing me beyond endurance," he cried. "Well, I will. It all happened as we planned it. You went off, and Peter he frightened the horses, and they run and throwed out the gent that was in the carriage. I never heard why he hadn't gone with ye in the cars. And Peter he run like a streak of lightning up to Avonmore, and shouted out that Mr. Monteith was throwed out and killed entirely. And Mrs. Craven ran with the ill news to the beautiful lady, and she, purty cratur, fell down in convulsions, and I was there, having just come up to the big house, chance like. to get word with the lady, and I was called right in, and there wasn't time to get the doctor there afore it was all over, and certain sure the saints or the devil helped us again, for there were two o' the little craters, as like as two peas, and both mason like the mother, and one was dead. No, it drawed a few breaths, but that was all, and the other was living. Two twins? Cried Dr. Monteith, starting to his feet. What a fool I have been, never to think of that. But what became of the living one? He asked in most frantic tones. You got her now, doctor, and you've had her this some years back. So don't be for taking revenge on a poor old crater as has been repenting all the time, day and night, since ever the black deed was done. Nina, my own? Is it? Can it be true? He cried, a gleam of unspeakable joy lighting up his features for an instant. But oh, my wife, my murdered wife! And his head sank upon his breast, everything else forgotten in the bitter anguish of that thought. Judy shuddered. She seemed unconscious like. She muttered in a hoarse whisper, but there was a little faint cry from the living one, and she opened her eyes and looked at it, and tried, feeble-like, to reach for it, when Mrs. Craven put the dose into its mouth. That was to keep it quiet till it could be hid away. And that was what she tried so hard to tell me with her last dying breath, she groaned. Oh, my darling, would that I could have understood you. Yes, I knowed it was, and I could hardly keep in from telling it all out myself, muttered Judy, when I see the bitter grief in her sweet young face, and in your own, doctor. But the old she-devil, she shaked her head at me, and I daren't spake a word. And what did you and she do with my child? The dose made it sleep like a stone, and me daughter came up to the house to spake till her mother, and she carried it away under her shawl. We kept it in our house near a week, when Mrs. Craven took it away. She didn't tell me where, but I found it all out since. She took it to a farmhouse somewheres in New England, to folks that hadn't no childer of their own, and they were good to it, and made a great pet of it while they lived. But both of 'em died when the little creature was about 10 year old, and then it was took to Philadelphy by some folks as didn't treat it well, and then off to another place up country somewheres, and then after a while she ran off and come to you, and so you've got your own at last. She stopped, seemingly exhausted by the exertion of saying so much. He rose and was moving away, but she caught his arm again. Wait, she whispered, there's a bit more. I liked the purty little crater, and I was very sorry for yees too, and I dressed her in some of the purty clothes we found that the mother had got ready for her, and I looped up her sleeves with some bits o' ornaments made up o' red beads and bright gold clasps to them, and I pinned the little baby blanket close around her, so Mrs. Craven shouldn't see him, case I thought maybe they'd help the poor little creature to find her own folks some day, and I slipped in one of the lady's beautiful handkerchiefs, trimmed with elegant lace. Mrs. Craven never said nothing about 'em, so I don't know whether she found 'em and took 'em off or not. Thank you, he said. They may be of great assistance in proving my child's identity. And then he groaned, Oh, my Nina, my darling, thinking not of his child, but of his wife. He was moving away from the bedside, but Judy cried out, And where'd he leave me now to die of me hurts? And now when I've told ye all this about your daughter, you are not dying, he said, coming back to her, and having relieved your mind, it may be that you will recover. I have dressed your wounds, and done all that I can for you at present. And now I must leave you with your son and daughter, and go home for a little rest. I will come again in a few hours to see how you are. May God forgive you for the crime you have confessed, as I do. Wait, doctor, there's more to tell. There was no one in the room with them now. Katy had gone out to attend to her children some time before, and Murphy had long since crept away to his bed, for he was weary with his day's work, and Judy's story was told ramblingly and at intervals as she found strength and breath. Had you ever a little boy, doctor? She asked. He started, and his heart seemed to come up into his mouth as he replied, Yes, but he lived only 2 years. Are you sure of that? Did you see him die? She questioned, half raising herself from a pillow in her eagerness. No, I was away at the time, in Europe, but He didn't die then. I could even almost take me oath on that." "How? What do you know of it?" he asked in intense excitement. Could it be that he was to recover both of his long lost darlings? "Well, a year or so afore the things happened that we've been talking about, Mrs. Craven came to Philadelphia, and she had the purtiest little 2-year-old boy with her. I was living with me daughter Bridget. She was taking care of another little chap just the same age to a month, and he was very sick when Mrs. Craven come, and Biddy was worried most out of her senses, case he was a rich widdy man's son, and she was well paid for taking care of him, and she didn't like to lose the wages, and was feared too that the father would blame her if the child died. Well, Mrs. Craven, she sat there with us for an hour, looking first at one little chap and then the other, with them sharp black eyes o' hern, and just when she was getting up to go, the child was took all of a sudden with a fit and died. Biddy, she was most wild, and Mrs. Craven, she says, 'Don't fret, Bridget, but listen to me. You say the father of this child hasn't seen it for a year. Now he can't know much about its looks. They change so at that age. S'pose he palmed this one on to him?' And she put her hand on the leetle chap she'd brought with her, and telled us he was an orphan and had no friends, and we'd be doing a real charity to make the rich widdy man believe he was his own, and she'd just take the dead un away with her and have it buried in New York." Dr. Monteith's breath came hard and pantingly between his shut teeth, and he clenched his hands till the nails were buried in the flesh. "So we agreed to it," continued Judy, "and kept the living child while she took away the dead. And the widdy man he never found it out till the little fellow had grown up and turned Protestant, and then the priest he made Bridget tell it when the father lay a dying, the widdy man I mean, and he just disinherited the boy and left him without a cent. And then he come to you, and you took him in, and I'd heard you give him your name. And there was some letters on some of his little clothes, real fine stuff they was made of, too. If you lift the lid on your chest, you'll see a little roll of linen in that fur corner. It's the little shirt he had on, and it's got the letters on it." Dr. Monteith hastily crossed the room, and with a trembling hand lifted the lid of the chest and drew forth a tiny roll. He unfolded it, and his eye fell upon the initials CEM in his own handwriting. With a cry, "My son, my little Ernest, my darling boy!" he let it fall, and covered his face with his hands. I knowed it," cried Judy, fairly starting up in the bed in her excitement. "I knowed they was brother and sister, and I've been awful worried lest they'd be getting married to other, and that's just what kept her a coming round here, and trying to get the purty young crathur away, by fair means or by foul." She sank back panting and groaning upon her pillow. "Then it was she, Mrs. Craven, who so tormented my poor Nina?" exclaimed the doctor inquiringly as he stepped to the bedside again. Tell me, what do you know of her plans and purposes? Did she bring you into this neighborhood that you might assist her?" No, doctor. No, I come here of myself to be with Katy, and didn't know ye lived near, and she knowed nothing of where I was till Mary Haggerty sent her word about the young lady, and she came here to see what she could do to get her away from yees. And then she was aiming at again robbing me of my darling. I was sure of it." "Indeed she was, doctor, and there's no knowing when she'll be after trying it again," panted Judy. He administered a restorative, waited a moment for it to take effect, then asked, "What do you know of her doings? Remember your promise to make a clean breast to me." She nodded her head. Yes, I'm a going to. She wants to get the young lady into a convent, for she knows he'd never be able to get her out of that if onset she was safe in there, without your knowing where she was. You see, she's been awful feared he'd find out she was your own, and then claim the property she got by her wife's death. And she was worried it too, for fear the brother and sister would marry each other, and so she tried coaxing and trying carrying her off, but couldn't do neither." "Then she has been at the bottom of all these attempts," he said. "She was the gypsy fortune teller, I suppose, and the writer of these anonymous notes, and the instigator of the wretch who sprang out upon my daughter when riding along the road and seized the bridle of a pony?" "Sure, sir, she was at the bottom of all thim doin's," groaned Judy, moving restlessly on her pillow, and 'twas her own son as caught the pony's bridle, and it was an awful blow the young lady gave him right in the eyes. He was here for days afore they could get him away, and was groaning and swearing and screaming with the pain all the time, but too feared of being took to jail to send for a doctor to tend to him. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 44. Great Sorrow and Great Joy. The first faint signs of the coming day might be discerned in the eastern sky as Dr. Monteith left the cottage of the Murphys and walked down the road toward Wold. He moved with the hurried step of one under great and unusual excitement. Not pleasurable, for his head was bowed upon his breast. His hands were tightly clenched, and a groan, a sigh, or a muttered word, breathed in tones of anguish, now and then burst from his lips. My murdered wife, my darling, oh, the cruel, cruel wretch, the fiend. He gained his own room without disturbing anyone in the still sleeping household. Then followed some hours of fearful anguish, of terrible conflict with the natural desire for vengeance, mingled with earnest prayer for help to forgive as he would be forgiven. He was heard. A great calm followed the tempest, the peace of God filling his heart and soul, while the thought of the present bliss of his beloved one and the joyful reunion with her which awaited him greatly assuaged his bitter sorrow. The new day had brought with it renewed health and hope to Nina, and she had left her bed saying to herself, "Why should I be so despairing? If he loves me with half the passionate fervour that he possesses, he will not be discouraged by one rejection. He will come back and again lay his heart at my feet, and will prize me all the more for the difficulty in winning me." And hurrying through her toilette, she ran gaily down the stairs and out upon the lawn, warbling a song almost as sweet and joyous as those the birds were singing over her head. Her father's voice recalled her to the house. He stood in the doorway, and as she bounded to his side, she exclaimed of his pale and haggard looks, "You are ill, father. You ought to be in bed. They have kept you up all night. What a shame! And yet how glad you look! My darling, my Nina, my own daughter," he cried, catching her in his arms and straining her to his breast in a transport of joy, and kissing her lips, her cheeks, her forehead, her eyes. "My own, and my Nina's child, bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." At his words a sudden paleness overspread her face, and she looked up eagerly and inquiringly into his. Could he really mean it? Could it be true? Yes, yes, it is the truth. "You are, in very deed, my own darling child, given to me by God himself," he said in answer to her look. And with a wild cry of unutterable joy, she threw her arms about his neck, and, hugging him close and closer still, returned his caresses, then hid her face on his breast in a burst of tears and sobs. Never had she been so unspeakably happy as at that moment, yet her tears and sobs seemed rather the tokens of grief, and Ernest, coming hastily down the stairs, asked in a tone of concern and alarm as he stepped quickly to her side what had happened to disturb her thus. Dr. Monteith started at the sound of his voice, and half disengaging himself from Nina, held out his hand, his face beaming with joy, love, and paternal pride. "Ernest, my son, this is joy, not grief, and you too are a sharer in it. You are my own children. She is my daughter, your sister, and I the glad father of you both. Can you believe it? Can you realize it?" He spoke rapidly, eagerly, and drawing the young man to his side, threw an arm around him also, while Nina, lifting her head with another joyful cry, turned and threw herself upon her brother's neck. Ernest put his arm about her, but looked from one to the other in a bewildered way, wondering if it were not all a dream. "It is no dream, my son," said Dr. Monteith in a voice that trembled with emotion. "Not a dream, but a blessed reality. I have just learned, by the tardy confession of one of the guilty parties, that you are my own children, whom I had long believed dead, but who were really stolen from me in infancy." Ernest's face flushed. Tears of joy sprang to his eyes. He gave Nina a fervent embrace, then putting her gently aside, threw himself upon his father's breast, crying, "My father, my dear, dear father, thank God that I am no longer alone in this world." "Ah, yes, thank God, thank Him and bless His holy name for this, His unmerited goodness and mercy to us," echoed Dr. Monteith in low, moved tones. He drew them into the library, and seating them upon a sofa and himself between them, with an arm about each, briefly related the whole story. They wept with him over the untimely death of their lovely young mother, and listened with grief and indignation to the account of the wrongs she and they had suffered at the hands of Mrs. Craven. Yet mingled with these bitter feelings, and even stronger than they, was the sweet new joy of their restoration to each other. Their father told them something of his own fearful struggle, his victory gained by a strength not his own, the sweet peace that now filled his soul, and exhorted them to forgiveness and love toward those who had wronged them. He was still speaking, they were still hanging about his neck with tears of love and joy, when Aunt Lettice came in, and the story had to be repeated to her. Her surprise, her joy, her gratitude were scarcely less than theirs, and she shared their grief and indignation also, even her gentle spirit being roused for a time to a desire for vengeance upon the principal author of all their woes. "I always felt doubtful of Mrs. Craven's professions of love to our darling Nina, and of grief for her loss," she said, addressing Dr. Monteith, while the tears streamed down her aged cheeks. "I had no proof, but I felt that they were insincere. Yet who could have believed her capable of such crimes? It is not easy to forgive her, but the other, poor old Judy, was but a tool, and doubtless has bitterly repented of her share in the dreadful business." "She has," said the doctor, "and now I remember that she told me of gold clasped ornaments with which she looped up the infant's sleeves, and of a lace trimmed handkerchief which she folded about its neck, hoping that they would some day assist in the discovery of its true parentage." "Yes, I missed those armlets, and supposed they had been stolen," said Mrs. Barron. "Oh, I have seen them. They are in Mrs. Powell's possession now, I presume," cried Nina, clapping her hands with delight as this new proof of the truth of Judy's story. "They were some years ago, and I greatly wondered how she had come by them, but little suspected that they belonged to me. Oh, what a hypocrite that woman is!" "Try to judge her leniently, my daughter," said the doctor. "But we must recover them," he added thoughtfully. "Everything that my wife's hand has touched is precious to me." Lily met them at the breakfast table, and glanced with surprise from one beaming, excited countenance to another. "We have no secrets from you, daughter," said Dr. Monteith smilingly, and Ernest's heart leaped at the word, "but desire to make you a sharer in all our joys. We have a wonderful tale to tell you this morning, a wonderful instance of the goodness of our God in bringing to light a secret that has darkened our lives for many years past." With this preface he began and quickly unfolded the strange story to her astonished ears, and she heartily rejoiced with them, though she now learned for the first time that there had ever been any mystery to be revealed in regard to the birth of Ernest and his sister. They lingered long over the table that morning, yet the viands were carried away almost untouched. A glad thanksgiving went up from the family altar, the servants joining in it with all their hearts, and then they turned their thoughts to the duties of the day. "You need rest, father. You ought at once to take some hours of sleep," said Ernest. "Can you trust your patients to me?" "Yes, my son," replied the happy father, with an indescribably joyous intonation on the last word. "Come with me to the office, and I will give you the necessary directions." They left the room, and Aunt Lettice followed, intent on some household duty. Lily ran away and shut herself up to write her letter, which seemed a harder task than ever. The home she was resigning was so full of sunshine, joy, and love, and Nina found herself alone. She tied on the garden hat and wandered out into the grounds, half unconsciously bending her steps to the spot where she and Marchant had parted yesterday, parted in anger and, as she then believed, forever. She did not believe it now. Oh no, he would come back, perhaps today or tomorrow. And with what joy would he learn that the only impediment to their union was taken out of the way, that she had now a name and a pedigree quite equal to his own. How glad she was that he had offered yesterday. How she would have despised him and doubted the reality of his love if he had waited for this mystery to be cleared up. She could now fully appreciate his family pride and his nobleness of soul in thus sacrificing it to his love, and she hated herself as she thought of the return she had made. But he would come back, and all would be made right between them. She repeated it to herself again and again in the vain effort to silence the misgivings that marred the deep, unutterable joy which had come to her that day. Ernest received his directions, rose to go, paused, hesitated, looked at his father, coloured deeply, and resumed his seat, with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the carpet. "What is it, my son?" asked the doctor, the proud, fond, fatherly affection in his tones thrilling through Ernest's very heart. It gave him courage to speak, to pour out the whole story of his love for Lily, and ask his father's approval and his permission to prefer his suit. The doctor gave it warmly. "She is as dear as a daughter to me now," he said. "Win her if you can, my dear boy, yet do not set your heart on marrying at once. You are both too young in my judgment, Lily too frail and delicate. You must wait a year at least." "Yes, sir," assented Ernest with a half sigh. "I ought also to first prove my ability to support a wife, which my profession will not enable me to do under a year, at the shortest." "Ah, I'm glad to hear you say that. It is the right kind of feeling," replied his father, with an approving smile. "For though I am, of course, abundantly able to support you all, I would not like to see you willing to fold your hands in idleness, and live in dependence upon another, even though that other was your own father. However, the recovery of the Avonmore estate, of which there can now hardly be a doubt, will soon give you abundant means of your own. Yet as a Christian you will still feel it a duty to make good use of time and talents, and, as an affectionate and dutiful son, will not marry till your father gives his consent. I should be unworthy of such a father if I could for an instant entertain the idea," replied the young man warmly, as again he rose to go. Lily was reading alone in the library just before the dinner hour, when Dr. Monteith came in and seated himself on the sofa by her side. She closed her book and looked up into his face with a blush and a smile. "Well, my dear little girl," he said, taking her hand in one of his and stroking and patting it affectionately with the other, "I found your note on my office table just now, and read it with some little surprise. I'm sorry you want to leave us. How soon do you intend to return?" I have hardly made any definite plan in regard to that, sir," she answered, a vivid blush suffusing her fair cheeks as she spoke. "Well, don't let us be deprived of your society too long," he said. "And if you are not in too great haste to get away, you would do me a favor by putting off your journey for a week or so, that Aunt Lettice may not be left alone in our absence." She looked up inquiringly. "I am going to take my son and daughter to Millcote, Oakdale, and Avonmore," he said. "On what business you will be at no loss to conjecture. We expect to start next Monday, and will probably be absent several days. But Aunt Lettice does not care to accompany us. Will you stay with her?" "Oh yes, sir, gladly. It will not inconvenience you?" "No, sir, not in the least." "Lily," whispered Ernest, coming to her side that evening, as she sat before the piano, running her fingers lightly over its keys, "you are losing all this beautiful moonlight. Did you not enjoy our stroll last night sufficiently to repeat it now?" There was a slight tremulousness in his tones, and an ill-suppressed eagerness, that made her heart flutter and brought the warm blood to her cheek. She was glad that the light from the shaded lamp on the distant centre table did not make it visible to him. "Where are the others?" she asked. "Aunt Lettice has fallen asleep in her chair, and father has carried Nina off somewhere, to see old Judy, I suppose. She begged to see the sweet young lady, that she might ask her pardon. Will you come?" "Yes," she murmured, rising and taking his offered arm. It was still early when Dr. Monteith and Nina returned. They had walked home in utter silence, her hand in his, the thoughts of both full of the sad past Judy had been speaking of. He led her to the library, and taking her in his arms, folded her close to his heart, holding her there as a precious treasure from which he could never bear to part. Neither spoke for many minutes. Her arms were about his neck, her cheek lay close to his. "Oh, what a joy this day has brought me," he murmured at last. "My own darling little daughter, how precious you are to your father's heart. How can I ever resign you to another, as I suppose I must some day?" "No, never, father, my own dear, dear father," she cried, clinging more closely to him and returning his caresses. For he was pressing warm kisses on her forehead, her cheeks, and on her lips. "Nobody shall ever take me away from you." He smiled half sadly as he stroked her hair with a thoughtful look. "I do not like to think of it," he said with a slight sigh. "But I doubt not there will come a time when I shall hold only the second place in your heart, and it is right that it should be so." "But I will never, never leave you, never," she cried, hugging him closer and closer. "We will always live together. You must never forgive me to anyone who will take me away from you." "No, I will not," he said, smiling fondly upon her. "So be careful whom you allow to steal your heart." A lamp was burning on the table near to which they had seated themselves, and the evening paper lay beside it. Presently he took it up and glanced over it. His eye fell upon a list of passengers sailing by that day's steamer, and he uttered an exclamation of astonishment. "What, Marchand de Vere gone to Europe, gone without so much as coming to bid us good bye, or to tell of his intention? It is very strange, very." He felt Nina's arms tighten about him as he spoke, and a shiver run through her frame, and glancing at her face, he saw it turn deadly pale, then flush crimson. He pushed the paper from him, put back the long clustering curls that half veiled her face, and gazing earnestly into it, said in a grieved voice, "You know something of this, my daughter. Ah, is it so? Has my little girl rejected one to whom she had certainly given great encouragement? Such conduct was not worthy of my darling." "Oh, father, don't be angry with me," she murmured in tones of suppressed anguish. "I did not think you would be so ready to give me away." And the tears she so rarely shed burst forth in a torrent. "Hush, hush, my precious child," he said, soothing her with the tenderest caresses, and again clasping her close to his heart. "It was not that, not that. No, no, it was only that I would have you too noble and true to find pleasure in winning hearts only to break them, or in anything that can give needless pain to another." "Did you want me to accept Marchand?" she asked almost under her breath. "Not unless you loved him, though he is dear as a son to me," he answered with gentle tenderness. "But it grieves me that you should raise hopes in his breast which you never meant to gratify." It was on her tongue to tell of her bitter provocation, but no, she could not stoop to that. She would sooner bear even the reproaches of the father she almost idolized, sooner lose his good opinion, which she valued above everything else. "Forgive me, dear, dear father," she murmured. "Only forgive me this one, and I will never play the coquette again. Ah, I could not bear to lose your love. No, not the least bit of it." "That you need never fear, my own precious child," he said. "I have nothing to forgive. Your sin was against God and Marchand, not against me. And now we will say no more about this painful subject. Here come Ernest and Lily," he added in a whisper. "Dry your eyes, that they may not ask the cause of your tears." Nina too had heard the approaching footsteps, and hastily leaving her father's arms, she withdrew into the shadow of the window curtain. At the same instant Ernest entered with the blushing Lily on his arm, both faces radiant with happiness. He led her to Dr. Monteith. "Father, I bring you another daughter," he said in low, thrilling tones of deepest joy. "She has promised to be mine. You will love her for my sake and for her own?" "I will, my son, I do," he answered in a moved tone, and as they knelt before him, he laid a hand on each drooping head and gave them a father's blessing. Nina could bear no more. She glided noiselessly from the room. Glad and thankful she was for Ernest and Lily. She had never loved them better than at that moment. But oh, the bitter anguish of the thought that a like cup of happiness had been presented to her lips, and that her own hand had madly dashed it away. And now Marchand was gone, gone so far away, Seas would roll between them, and he would never come back. Never. How could she have imagined for a single instant that he would have so little self-respect as to return and repeat an offer which she had rejected with such scorn and contempt? No, if he possessed one spark of manliness, he would never do it, and she would despise him for it if he did. But no one should suspect that she ever had cared for him, and she would not any longer. She would tear his image from her heart and forget that ever he had been more to her than friend and brother. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley, Chapter 45. Caught in Her Own Net. Elsie Powell, put down that book and help me to clear this table. That lazy Bridget is not half through the washing yet. Mrs. Powell's voice had lost none of its sharpness in the 3 years that had rolled by since Nina's departure from Millcote, and Essie rose quickly from her seat by the window, glancing from it as she laid her book on its sill. "Mother, mother," she exclaimed, "there's a carriage stopping at our gate, the handsomest carriage I ever saw, with a coloured driver and coachman." "Esther, when will you learn to express yourself properly?" interrupted her mother. "Don't waste time standing there. They can want nothing here but to inquire their way." "No, mother, they must be coming in," cried the little girl in a low, excited tone, "for they have got out of the carriage, 2 gentlemen and a lady, and one of the gentlemen is opening the gate. Go to the door then and ask them into the parlor. I must run up the back stairs and change my dress. I'll see no such grand people in this old faded calico wrapper." The visitors were already on the porch when Esther reached the front door, which stood wide open. A tall, fine-looking man in the prime of his life was in the act of ringing for admittance, while a little in his rear stood a younger gentleman, strongly resembling him in form and feature, and a lady of surpassing beauty. She was glancing about her with a look of eager interest, and as her eye fell upon Essie, she sprang forward with a joyful cry. "Oh, you darling, how glad I am to see you!" and catching her in her arms, hugged her closely, kissing her over and over again. "Don't you know me, Essie, darling?" she cried. "Nina, my own Nina!" cried the child, her voice ringing out joyously, as she gave one look up into the bright, beautiful face, then returned the caress with tears of delight. "Oh, I thought you'd never, never come back any more," she sobbed, hiding her face on Nina's neck. "And I thought I never should either," said Nina, smoothing back the waves of sunny hair with soft caressing hand, and as the little face was lifted to hers again, gazing lovingly into the sweet, tearful blue eyes. "But here I am, and my own dear father and brother with me, and you must let me introduce you to them. Father and brother Ernest, this is my darling little Essie, of whom you have so often heard me speak. She has grown a great deal, but I think I should have known her dear face anywhere." "It is a dear face, one to remember and to love," said Dr. Monteith, taking the little hand in his and stooping to press a fatherly kiss on the white forehead of the blushing child. Ernest shook hands with her also, and Essie, still clinging to Nina and fluttering with joy, led the way to the parlor and begged them all to be seated. Nina glanced about her. How much smaller the room seemed than in former days, how much plainer the furniture, how stiff and precise its arrangement, the very type of its mistress. As beautifully neat and clean, too, as of yore. The muslin curtains hung in exact folds, and were white as the driven snow, and not a speck of dust could be seen, even when Essie pushed open the half-closed shutters and let in the full light of the bright summer's day. The young girl shivered at the thought of the life that would now be hers, had this continued to be her home, and her heart thrilled with deep joy and thankfulness as her eyes again sought the face of him she so loved and so delighted to call her own father. He read her thoughts in her speaking eyes, and his answering smile was full of tenderness and love. "Shall I call mother?" whispered Essie, returning to Nina's side. Yes, dear, in a minute. But tell me first if you are all well, and where are Ned and Belle, and your father and the rest? Father and Homer are gone back to the mill. Sylvester is in a store in the city now. Mother's upstairs, and Ned and Belle are somewhere about the house. I'll hunt them up if you want to see them. Presently, dear, said Nina, putting her arm around the child's waist and making her sit on the sofa by her side. But tell me first, did you get the dolls and other presents I sent you the first Christmas after I went away? I hoped you would send me a little letter to say how you liked them, but it never came. Essie's eyes opened wide with amazement. Did you send them? She cried. Well, I never could guess how Mamma came to spend so much money on us that Christmas, or why it seemed to vex her that we were all so pleased with the things. She wasn't at home when Father brought the box up from the cars, and he opened it right away, and we had the things in our hands when Mamma came in. And I always supposed she was vexed because she wanted to be the first to show them to us. But now I guess it was mostly because you sent them. And maybe she wouldn't have let us have them at all if she'd been at home when they came. Nina's lip curled with scorn and indignation. No doubt, she said. But you have missed me, Essie, you and Ned and Belle? Oh, yes, ever so much. But do tell me where you've been and how you found your own father and brother, whispered the child, with a shy glance at the two gentlemen, who at a distance sat silently listening to the conversation. But Nina's reply was prevented by the entrance of Mrs. Powell, who at that moment sailed in a rustling silk, never dreaming whom she was honoring by such a display of her cherished finery. As her eye fell upon Nina, whom she instantly recognized, for time had made little change in the fair young creature, save in the rounding out and perfecting of the slight graceful form, and of each lovely feature, and the enriching of the complexion with the growing tints of exuberant health and happiness. She stopped, and stood gazing at her like one struck dumb with astonishment, her face darkening with rage, her eyes flashing with scorn and contempt. She saw no one else, and the neat travelling dress with its snowy linen collar and cuffs, though the very perfection of good taste and ladylike simplicity, told nothing of the rank and wealth of the wearer. For a single instant the two looked into each other's eyes in utter silence. Then Mrs. Powell's rage and indignation found words. Miserable, depraved creature, she cried, how dare you enter my house after the way in which you have behaved, after returning such base ingratitude for all my care and kindness? Begone this instant, and never. Madam, interrupted Dr. Monteith, stepping to Nina's side and taking her hand in his, my daughter is here because I brought her. Therefore let your anger and indignation expend themselves upon me. I have a little business matter to transact with you. It need occupy but a few moments, and when that has been satisfactorily arranged, we will take our departure, and trouble you no more. His calm, quiet tones, his polite, gentlemanly address, and something in his appearance and his whole air and manner that told of undoubted wealth and respectability, silenced the woman, and covered her with shame and confusion. She stammered out an apology, and, sitting down on the nearest chair, waited in silence for what further he might have to say. He seated himself by Nina's side, still keeping her hand fast clasped in his, and passing his other arm about her waist. This is my daughter, he said, in tones of fond, proud affection, his eyes resting with a look of indescribable tenderness upon the beautiful face. My own darling child, whom God gave me some 18 years ago. But she was stolen from me on the day of her birth, and until within a few days I believed that she slept in the grave with her mother. Now I have learnt the truth by the confession of the nurse, who was an accomplice in the commission of the crime, and Nina has told me the story of her life with your sister and yourself, and of the revelation made to you by Mrs. Clemmens on her deathbed, and afterward by you to herself. The nurse has described to me the garments and ornaments worn by the babe at the time of its abduction. Nina remembers having seen such in your possession, no doubt committed to your care by your sister, and I have now come to ask for them, and for the note which you told Nina accompanied them, also for any further information in regard to the matter which you may be able to furnish. I would like greatly to hear all that you can recall of your sister's account of the way in which the child came into her possession. Mrs. Powell listened to his words with varying and by no means agreeable emotions. That Nina, whom she so cordially hated, should have arrived at so prosperous an estate, should have been proved of good birth and parentage, in spite of all her prognostications to the contrary, was as gall and wormwood to her proud, jealous, envious nature. Had it been in her power to dash the cup of happiness from the young girl's lips, by taking from her and her father the knowledge of their relationship, she would have done so without a moment's hesitation. And for the first time she bitterly repented of having revealed to Nina the secret that she was the child of Mr. and Mrs. Clemmens only by adoption. On the other hand, ever anxious to raise herself and her children in the social scale, and plainly perceiving that Dr. Monteith was far above them in that respect, she greatly regretted that, since Nina was now known to be his child, she had not treated her in a manner to win her gratitude and affection, in order that she might now assist her in rising to the station she so coveted. But the time for that had gone by. Nina would never forget or forgive her harshness, injustice, and oppression, or Dr. Monteith the cruel, insulting words she had but now addressed to his darling. So, seeing she could hope for nothing from them, she determined that they should gain nothing from her. But on the contrary, she would, as far as possible, gratify her avarice, next to ambition, her ruling passion, at their expense. With this resolve covering her self-possession, she observed a cold, haughty, reserved demeanour. "There is very little to tell, sir," she replied, drawing herself up and folding her arms with an air that said as plainly as words, "and you will find it no easy task to get from me what there is. But there is something. Yes, that the child was found lying on the doorstep of my brother-in-law's house, that he carried it in and showed it to his wife, and they foolishly determined to adopt it in place of one they had just lost, instead of sending it to the poorhouse as they should have done. That they did so, and treated it with an unwise indulgence that so fostered a naturally ungovernable temper, that when she came to me at their death she was already almost beyond control, and gave me more trouble than all my own five put together. Mamma did not find me difficult to control, nor would you if you had treated me with even tolerable kindness," exclaimed Nina with flashing eyes. "I treated you better than you deserved," said Mrs. Powell coldly. "If I was strict and sometimes a little severe, it was all intended for your good, and you ought to thank me for it, but rebellion and ingratitude were the only return you ever made for all my care and anxiety on your account, and all the added labor your presence in the family caused me." Nina was beginning an indignant rejoinder, but her father checked her. "Hush, hush, my darling," he said softly. "Do not degrade yourself by bandying words with the woman. It is beneath your dignity, and to return railing for railing is most unchristian." Then turning to Mrs. Powell, he again requested that she would now restore to him everything in her possession that had belonged to his infant child. "No," she said, "I claim them as given to me by my sister, who certainly acquired a right to them by all the expense and trouble Nina was to her in those 10 years. Did Mrs. Clemmens make them over to you as an absolute gift, or merely in trust for Nina?" he asked, fixing his eyes searchingly upon her face. She colored angrily. "They are mine," she said, compressing her thin lips with an air of determination. "They are mine, but a poor equivalent for all I have done for that ungrateful girl, to say nothing of the expense she has been to us." Mr. Powell entered the room as she finished her sentence. In their excitement, none of them had heard his approaching footsteps, and his wife looked up in surprise as he stepped eagerly forward and took Nina's hand, exclaiming, "Why, my dear child, how do you do, and where did you come from?" "Thomas!" cried his wife reprovingly, and he dropped Nina's hand and turned away without waiting for her reply. What is it, my dear?" he stammered. "What was it you were saying as I came in?" "What was I saying? Why, telling this man he hasn't condescended to tell me his name, but seems to consider it quite sufficient for me to know that he's Nina's father, that the baby clothes, etc., that my sister gave me on her deathbed, belong not to Nina, but to me, not only because they were Esther's gift, but that the trouble and expense we have gone to on account of that child are worth 10 times what those paltry rags would sell for." "I beg your pardon, madam, for forgetting to introduce myself. My name is Monteith," said the doctor, and when he quietly asked what was the yearly sum paid over to you for Nina's support by the trustees of the property bequeathed by her adopted parents, "'Twasn't any regular sum. They just paid the bills, whatever they happened to come to. Sometimes more, sometimes less," stammered Mr. Powell. while his wife, giving him a furious look, said, "Whatever it was, that makes no difference in the rights of the thing, for my sister's property ought to have come to me, her nearest relation." "I cannot see that," replied Dr. Monteith quietly. "Your sister and her husband had undoubtedly the right to leave their property to whomsoever they pleased. But as I am by no means willing that my daughter should lie under the smallest obligation, real or fancied, to one who could speak to and of her as you have done in my hearing to-day, I will pay for her maintenance during the time that she was an inmate of your house. Bring me the articles I have asked for, then make out your bill, and I will give you a check on my Philadelphia banker." "She was with us 5 years," said Mrs. Powell, with the eager look of one about to pounce upon a treasure. "Not quite," interrupted Nina. "Never mind, we will call it 5," said the doctor. "Then say 300 a year. It will come to $1,500, added Mrs. Powell greedily. The doctor's face expressed supreme contempt for her meanness and cupidity. He knew perfectly well from the accounts Nina had from time to time given him of their mode of life and her scanty clothing, that, entirely setting aside the value of the child's services, as well as the fact that her expenses had been already amply repaid in money, the woman was now asking nearly double the amount of all that had been expended on Nina during those 5 years. Mr. Powell, who was watching the doctor's face narrowly, read his thoughts in his expression. "It is too much comfort, and he is businessman enough to know it," he whispered, putting his lips close to his wife's ears. "Half a loaf is better than no bread, and we must say something less. My wife is a little wrong in her arithmetic," he added aloud. "Suppose we say 200 a year." "Very well," said Dr. Monteith. "When you have placed those articles in my hand, you may bring me writing materials, and I will make out a check for 1,000. There was a gleam in Mrs. Powell's eyes as she rose and left the room, turning on the threshold to give her husband a warning look. He received it with a meek expression, but the instant she was gone his countenance brightened, and drawing near to Nina, he again took her hand, saying in a kindly tone, "Well, my dear, I'm right glad to see you're prospering. You know you were always a favorite of mine. Only for peace sake I had to keep it to myself before her," motioning with his head in the direction of the door through which his better half had just vanished. "Yes, you were always kind to me," replied Nina, bestowing upon him one of her sweet, winning smiles. "And so you've really found your own father?" he said, glancing at Dr. Monteith. "How in the world did you manage that?" "She did not manage it, nor I," said the doctor, answering for his daughter, "but God in his good providence brought us together, taught us to love one another, and at length revealed to us our true relationship." Esther had gone in search of Ned and Belle, and Nina was listening eagerly for their coming, but instead Mrs. Powell's returning footsteps were heard, and her spouse hastily retreated to the farther side of the room, and meekly sat down upon the chair on which she had left him. She came in carrying a small wooden box, which she deposited on the table and unlocked with a key that she took from her pocket. Dr. Monteith's face grew momentarily paler as she produced to lift out one article after another and spread them before him. The handkerchief and the ornaments she placed in his hands. One glance was sufficient. He recognized them. A deep sigh burst from his pale, quivering lips. Ernest and Nina had drawn near and were looking on with intense interest. Nina's eyes filled, and in her quick, impulsive way she caught the handkerchief from her father's hand and pressed it to her lips, then threw her arms around his neck with a passionate burst of weeping. Oh, if she could only come back! "My own dear, dear mother!" she sobbed. "No, darling, do not wish that. She does not dearly as she loves us. She cannot return to us, but we shall go to her," murmured Ernest softly. Mr. Powell sat watching them with a look of keen sympathy, his wife with a contemptuous curl of her lip. "Thomas, why do you sit gaping there?" she asked severely. "If you cared to attend to your own affairs, you'd be hunting up writing materials. They'll be wanted presently." "Oh, yes, of course, my dear. I'll bring them at once," he said, starting up in confusion and hurrying from the room. "Bring a newspaper, too, to wrap these things in," she called after him. "The box and towels belong to me." "Pitifully mean as ever," thought Nina. But at that moment Essie came softly in, and paying no heed to her mother's frown, which she did not seem to see, put her arms lovingly around Nina. "I could not find the children," she said. "I believe they've gone off to school. And I'm so sorry. Ned talks of you yet, and he will have a good cry when he hears that he has missed seeing you." Mr. Powell returned with the articles he had been sent for, and spreading out the newspaper, Mrs. Powell was about to wrap the infant's clothing in it, but Nina sprang forward and prevented her. "No, let me do it," she said, hastily pushing her aside, for she felt that the touch of her dead mother's fingers had hallowed each little garment, and that Mrs. Powell's would pollute them. "As you please, miss. It is quite immaterial to me," replied the latter, stiffly. Then turning to Dr. Monteith, "Will you write the check now?" she asked, with a wave of her hand toward the table where the writing materials were placed in readiness. Bowing a silent assent, he wrote and complied with her request. She clutched the check eagerly as he handed it to her, scanned it attentively for a moment to make sure there was no deception, then with a bland smile remarked, "You must be very wealthy to part with your money so easily, and to be able to deck wife and child in such costly finery as that," she added, with a motion of her head toward the bundle on Nina's lap. "Are you not satisfied with what I have given you?" he asked with cool contempt. "I ask no more from you, though I might have reminded you of the interest this money would have brought during all these years," she answered unblushingly. "But as you will have plenty to leave your children, and I have little or nothing to give mine, I think it would be no more than fair that Nina should return my sister's property to me. Esther would never have left it to her if she could have foreseen all this." "Perhaps not," he replied, while Nina, springing to her feet, cried out impetuously, "You shall have it back. I told you long ago I should never touch another farthing of it, and I never will. Father, can we not make it all over to her now?" "Not all in a moment, daughter," he said gently. "You have no power to dispose of the property until it is placed in your hands on your coming of age. Mrs. Powell, you need have no fear that I will counsel my daughter to retain $1 of your brother-in-law's money. And now, as your business is concluded, we will take our departure. Are you ready, Nina?" "Yes, sir, but," as she turned to Mr. Powell, "I would like to see old Peggy for a moment, if I may." "She's dead and buried long ago," said Mrs. Powell shortly, answering for her husband. Nina looked shocked, and was moving toward the door when Essie threw her arms around her with a cry. "Oh, Nina, Nina, don't go yet. Stay a little longer. Will you ever come back again?" "I think not, dear," she said, returning the child's caress with tears in her eyes. "I think not, little Essie. But if you can persuade your mother to let you pay a visit to Wald, my beautiful country home in Philadelphia, I shall be delighted to see you." She looked inquiringly at Mrs. Powell, but the latter made no reply, and with a cold good afternoon they parted. "What could you have been thinking of, Comfort, not to catch at such a chance as that for our little girl?" exclaimed Mr. Powell, looking regretfully after the carriage as it rolled away. It was only for the moment that her hatred to Nina gained the better of her worldly wisdom, and she was already regretting it as keenly as he did. But a reproof from such a quarter was not to be borne, and turning sharply upon him, she demanded, "Is it possible, Thomas Powell, you could for a moment imagine that I would sacrifice my child's spiritual interests to her temporal by exposing her to the contamination of that girl's society? No, I hope I am far too good and faithful a Christian mother for that." She swept past him into the sitting room where the dinner table still stood as she left it half an hour before, and began energetically piling up the dishes. He followed her with an uneasy look on his face. "Comfort," he said in an undertone, standing close at her elbow. "They will doubtless go on now to Oakdale to see Mr. Lancaster and Dr. Blake, and then it will all come out." "Well, what if it does? Who cares?" she asked, turning fiercely upon him, but with a blanching cheek. "The money was mine of right, and didn't she tell me she'd never touch a cent of it?" "That's the way it appears to us, but everybody might not see it in that light," he answered with a covering, troubled look. "I'm afraid we haven't acted according to law, and it would be a bad business for us if they should see fit to prosecute." End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 46. Oakdale. Yes, there it is, my dear old home, looking just as it did when I left it almost 8 years ago. And Nina's lovely face looked eagerly from the window as the carriage rolled rapidly down the familiar road and drew up before the little white gate in front of Oakdale farmhouse. Just as it did, except that everything seems to have grown smaller, she repeated, as her father assisted her to alight. The door opened, Kizzy rushed out, and the two ran into each other's arms. Kizzy, you dear old Kizzy, you have not changed one bit. You are just what you were when Mrs. Powell carried me off from you, cried Nina in an ecstasy of delight. Well, I think you'll take that back when you've looked a little harder, returned Kizzy, kissing her and crying over her. And I can't say the same of you, for you went away a forlorn little child, half broken-hearted, and you've come back the beautifulest and happiest-looking young woman I ever sought eyes on. Let me take a good look at ye, and she held her off at arm's length, gazing into the air face with so ardent an admiration that it sparkled all over with smiles and blushes. Were you expecting us? Asked Nina. Oh, I must not forget to make you acquainted with my father and brother. My very own they are, Kizzy. Yes, I know. Dr. Blake, he brought the letter over and read it to me, said Kizzy, putting her toil-hardened hand into Dr. Monteith's as he held it out with a cordial smile. And so I was expecting you. I've been on the lookout ever since morning. How d'ye do, sir? How d'ye do? To the doctor and his son. I am as pleased as can be to see you, every one of you. Just walk right into the parlour. Nina knows the way, don't you, dearie? My, but it does my heart good to see your bright face in these rooms again. And what wonderful news that letter brought. I could hardly sleep a wink all night for thinking of it, though Jones was snoring away by my side, as if he meant to do the job for the two of us. You are married, Kizzy? Said Nina inquiringly, bringing her eyes back to her old friend's face after an eager wandering over the familiar furniture. I was so glad to hear that you were back in the old home again. Yes. I took a husband and 6 children about a year back, was the nonchalant reply. You see, the poor things would have had to be scattered among strangers, and I felt so sorry for him that as Jones wasn't nowadays disagreeable to me, sober and honest, and a good provider, I concluded I'd come and take care on them when he asked me. It looks pretty much as it did when she was alive, don't it? She asked, following Nina's glance as it wandered around the room. You know, the old furniture was stacked away in the garret for you when you come of age, and when I heard you was coming, I had a good bit of it brought down and sorted the old places. Oh, thank you, how very kind, but it must have given you a great deal of trouble. Not so much neither, replied Kizzy, taking Nina's hat and pushing forward for her use the large easy chair in which Mrs. Clemmens had passed so many weary hours during her last sickness, for we haven't so much of our own but what we could easily crowd it in 2 or 3 rooms. Kizzy, said Nina, you must keep this that was left to me. No, indeed, child. Do you think I would rob you? Was the almost indignant rejoinder. Mrs. Powell did enough of that to my thinking. But then all I want with it is to see it standing here as it stood in the old times, said Nina earnestly. And I hope to do so often, for I shall pay many a little visit in the future, if father will allow me to come. I will not refuse so reasonable a request, said Dr. Monteith, smiling fondly upon her. Well, then, I'll take the best care of it, and thank you 1,000 times too for the use of it, said Kezia, evidently much pleased with the offer. Would you like to go up to your rooms? I've fixed up your own old room for you, Nina. Excuse me, perhaps I ought to say Miss Monteith. No, I shall always be Nina to you, Kizzy. Thank you. That comes the most natural to me. Well, as I was saying, I've fixed up your old room for you just like it used to be, and the best chamber for the gentleman. Nina hardly waited to hear the conclusion of the sentence, but flew up to her room, leaving the others to follow at a more leisurely pace. "You're just the same old story, wild and frisky as a kitten," said Kezia, coming in after her and catching her in her arms for another hug and kiss. "Well, does it look like old times?" "Yes," said Nina, laughing and crying both together. "It's like the rest of the house, the same and not the same, smaller and plainer than of old, but just as neat and sweet and pretty. Oh, it makes me feel as if she must be here somewhere. Are you sure she's not?" And the beautiful face was hidden on Kezia's breast in a burst of passionate weeping. Yet it lasted but a moment. Kezia's rough hand was passed with gentle soothing movement over the soft curls but 2 or 3 times ere the head was raised again and the bright drops were dashed away. "There, I shall not shed another tear to make my dear father think I am unhappy," she said. "Oh, Kizzy, you do not know what a father he is to me. How dear, how kind, how good." "Yes, I guess I do. One look into his face would tell me that. Now, dearie, I'm going down to put your supper on the table, and you'll all just please to come to it whenever you're ready." Kezia had not forgotten Nina's tastes or lost one whit of her old skill in cooking, and the meal they presently sat down to was one fit for a king. The sun was still an hour high when they rose from the table, and Kezia, leaving the clearing away to the eldest of her stepdaughters, conducted her visitors over the house and grounds, which Nina was eager to see and to show to her father and brother. Then they bent their steps to the village graveyard, where Kezia pointed out to them the last resting place of Mr. and Mrs. Clemmens. The ground had filled up so much in the past 8 years that Nina would have had some difficulty in searching out the spot herself. She shed a few quiet tears as they stood about it, then, slipping her hand into her father's arm, allowed him to lead her away, though once or twice she looked back and gave a sigh to the memory of those who had made her early years so bright and happy. She asked for Mrs. Croft's grave too, and Kezia pointed it out and told of her peaceful death. On returning to the house, they found Dr. Blake waiting to see them. He met Nina with all the old cordiality, and gave Dr. Monteith a detailed account of all that he knew of her first arrival at Oakdale. He could not say what hand had laid her on the doorstep where Mr. Clemmens had found her. He had hardly finished his story when Mr. Lancaster, the other trustee, was announced. A long business conversation ensued, in which Dr. Monteith learned that his letter, received 2 days before, had given them the first intimation that Nina was not still living with Mr. and Mrs. Powell, who had continued to draw money for her support at regular intervals, for that purpose sending on bills for clothing, board, etc., as during the 5 previous years. The 2 trustees were highly indignant at the cheat, and strongly inclined to prosecute the offenders to the full extent of the law. But Dr. Monteith dissuaded them from it, saying he would rather they should be allowed to escape. The loss was as nothing to Nina, who intended to deed the property to the Powells as the nearest relatives to those who had willed it to her, and as such she would shield them from even merited disgrace. Dr. Blake and his co-executor yielded under protest, and contented themselves with a strong expression of their opinion of such conduct, given to the delinquents in the form of a joint letter entrusted to the males a day or 2 later. "If that Comfort Powell ain't the meanest woman alive, who would ever think she was Mrs. Clemmens' sister?" exclaimed Kezia, as she followed Nina to her room to see that she had everything she wanted for the night. "Oh, Kezia, you don't know anything about it," said Nina. "If you had spent 5 years with her, you might. Poor dear mamma, she little knew what a home she provided for me in committing me to her care." A long talk followed, in which, by comparing notes, they learned more of the woman's treachery in regard to letters, etc., than either had known before. The next morning found the Monteiths again on the wing. They were in too great haste to tarry longer at Oakdale, and all Kezia's entreaties could not keep them another day, but the promise of a second and longer visit from Nina within the year comforted her not a little. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 47, The Spoiler Spoiled. A woman stood before an open window, looking down upon a fair and beautiful landscape, a broad and noble river, its waters rippling in the breeze and sparkling in the golden light of the summer's sun, threaded its way between grand old mountains and richly wooded hills. Handsome country seats and pretty little villages, scattered here and there, adorned its banks, or nestled in the shadow of the hills and forests, while the nearer view was of a velvety lawn dotted with noble old trees and traversed by a broad carriageway, and of terraces gay with many-coloured flowers that filled the air with their delicious perfume. The sudden gloom of the woman's face was in striking contrast to the brightness and beauty without. She gazed but a moment, then turning hastily away, with a gesture of disgust, let fall a curtain of heavy damask, shutting out at once the sweet air, the glad sunshine, and all the pleasant sights and sounds that but now had greeted her eye and ear. "I hate them," she muttered, pacing to and fro in the darkened room, with clenched hands and tumultuously heaving breast. "I hate all this light, this gladness and beauty. I would cast a pall over the earth if I could, and make every mortal creature as utterly wretched as my miserable self. How dare they be so full of life and gladness when he, the idol of my heart, lies smouldering in the grave? What have I done that I should be tortured thus? Purgatory, hell itself could hardly add to my torments. And she who has robbed me of him, she is young, happy, and beloved, has all that heart could wish. Oh, for the power to crush her, trample her into the very dust, as I would a worm that crossed my path and lifted its puny head against me." And she ground her heel on the carpet and clinched her teeth with impotent rage. "Hark! What was that? Who comes to disturb me in the seclusion of my bereavement?" she muttered, as the sound of wheels came to her ear. And again drawing aside the curtain, she looked out. A carriage was coming up the drive, had almost reached the house, and, as she gazed, it turned and drew up before the front entrance. The roofs and pillars of the porch and the spreading branches of the tree prevented her from seeing who alighted from it, but she cared little for that, seeing she was determined to receive no one, either friend or foe. She turned away and resumed her walk and her bitter thoughts. "Madame," said a lady's maid, opening the door, "a gentleman wishes to see you on business." "A gentleman? Who? He gave no name, madame. I see no one on business but my lawyer. Is it he?" "I think not, madame, and I did my best to send him away, telling him that, being plunged in deep sorrow, you saw no one. But he will not be denied. He asserts that his business is of the utmost importance, cannot even be delayed, and that he must and will have a personal interview." An angry exclamation broke from the lips of the mistress, yet her curiosity was aroused. Who could this pertinacious stranger be? She would see him, since there seemed to be no getting rid of him without. "Bring me my cap, Martin," she said, "and see that my dress is all in order. That man is a gentleman, you say?" "Undoubtedly, madame. No one could question that after the first glance. I should say he was a distinguished person, a man of wealth and standing in society." "Did you show him into the drawing room?" asked the mistress, glancing at the reflection of her sallow visage and faded, sunken features in the glass, as her maid carefully adjusted the widow's cap over her iron grey hair and arranged the folds of her deep mourning dress. "I did, madame. No one possessed of the least sense or discernment could think of showing a gentleman of his appearance anywhere else." "There, that will do, Martin. A simple reply to my question was all that was called for. Open the door for me." The tone was commanding, her gesture imperious, and as the servant obeyed, she left the room with a soft, noiseless, gliding step that reminded one of a serpent, and which long habit had made second nature to her, passed down the broad staircase, across the wide entrance hall, and entered the spacious drawing room beyond. The first sight that there met her eyes was a charming vision of youth and beauty, a slight, graceful, girlish figure, and a face of matchless loveliness, at that moment radiant with the delight which a true lover of nature feels in gazing upon such a landscape as lay spread out before the open window beside which she was standing. A low exclamation of mingled surprise, anger, and alarm burst from the lips of the mistress of the mansion, and the sweet fair girl, starting at the sound, turned, and meeting the look of deadly hate in the gleaming black eyes, shuddered involuntarily and drew a step nearer to the young man at her side. "Fear nothing," he whispered, encircling her with his arm, while at the same instant there rose up before Madame another face, pale, calm, resolute, confronting her like the minister of avenging justice. She started back, putting up both hands before her face as if to ward off a blow, while she trembled from head to foot, and her very lips grew white. "You," she said in low, husky tones, "you, Clarence Ernest Monteith, what brings you here?" "I come to bring your crimes home to you, Delilah Craven," he answered, with low yet perfectly distinct utterance, "to accuse you as the murderer of my wife, the abductor of my children, the usurper of their inheritance." "I think you will find your accusations hard to prove," she said, with a desperate effort to recover her composure. "Their inheritance! I, a usurper! I have a better right to my brother's property than they, who have not the smallest claim to relationship. If Mr. Delacourt had died intestate, yes, but he had an undoubted right to bequeath to whom he would the property acquired by his own exertions, and you will know that his will left it to my wife and her surviving children." "Her surviving children? Pray produce them, and prove their identity," she cried, laughing a bitter, mocking laugh, but with the paleness of terror still on her cheek. "You yourself saw the one lying dead on her dead mother's breast, and the other had even then been in his grave for a year or more." "Such was your story," replied Dr. Monteith sternly, "but it was not the truth. You had given my son in exchange for the dead child of another, which you caused to be buried by Mr. Delacourt's side, announcing to us and to all the friends that it was our darling, whom you had taken away to Philadelphia, and left there alive and well. And though we buried a dead babe with its mother, there was also a living one, its twin sister, whom you secretly carried away and laid at the door of a New England farmhouse." The woman staggered back, almost gasping for breath, and sank half fainting into a chair. "You cannot prove it. The story is utterly false," she said hoarsely, while her hollow gleaming eyes, full of fear and hate, wandered from one to another of the three faces confronting hers. "I defy you to prove it." "I have the proof at hand," he said. "Judy Flanagan's full confession, taken down from her own lips by a justice of the peace, and in the presence of competent witnesses. Also articles of clothing and ornaments worn by the children, some of them marked with their initials. And here they stand before you, living witnesses to the falsity of your assertion that they died in infancy, their remarkable likeness to their parents furnishing strong proof of their identity." "And yet I deny it," she hissed between her clenched teeth. "Judy Flanagan has confessed a lie, perjured herself. For what bribe perhaps you can tell. Initials are easily marked on clothes and ornaments, and remarkable likenesses have been found where there existed not the slightest tie of kindred. No, Ernest Monteith, I defy you still." And rising, she stood proudly erect before him, with folded arms, firmly compressed lips, and eyes that blazed with fury, yet dared not meet the stern, steady gaze of his, but quickly sought the floor. A death-like hush filled the room for an instant. Then Dr. Monteith spoke, his calm, determined tones filling the guilty heart with fear. "You then refuse to acknowledge your guilt, and to make such restitution as now lies in your power? You would do well to consider the alternative, Delilah Craven. Summoned before a court of justice, tried by the laws of the land for these high crimes, your guilt proved by overwhelming evidence, you will find yourself condemned to the penitentiary for a long term of years, probably so long that death alone will bring you deliverance from your captivity. And pray, what may be this overwhelming evidence?" she asked with a scornful curl of her lip. "Methinks I have already disposed of it, and may perchance be able to produce counter evidence quite as satisfactory to a jury. The law is uncertain, Ernest Monteith, and wealth that can bribe witnesses and jurors a tower of strength." A slight sorrowful smile flitted across the doctor's features. "Your anger robs you of discretion," he said. "You are not wise thus to show me your weapons, and such weapons too. But they will not avail against the unbroken chain of evidence which I can produce with Aunt Lettice, Judy Flanagan, and her daughter, whose testimony will be conclusive in proof of your crime against Ernest and my murdered wife, whom you as truly slew as if you had stabbed her to the heart." His voice trembled with almost overpowering emotion as he pronounced these last words, and the woman's face assumed an ashen hue, though she still retained her proud bearing. He paused an instant to recover himself, then went on, his voice growing sterner with every word. Yes, Delilah Craven, her blood is on your hands, as is proved by Judy's testimony, and that of her grandson, whom you hired to frighten my horses, and then to hurry to Avonmore with the news of an accident to me. Hush, hush. I am no murderess. I could not know that it would make her ill or cause her death if it did, came in a whisper from the now pale and trembling lips, while her whole form shook like an aspen leaf. No, but you hoped it might, intended that it should, were rejoiced that it did. You had laid your plans for such result, and proceeded to carry them out. The birth of twins, one living, the other dead, and the utter exhaustion of the mother, enabling you to do so with an ease and entire success that you could hardly have hoped for. You carried away the living child. Judy can testify to that, and to the clothing and ornaments in which she herself arrayed it. Traitress! Hissed the pale, quivering lips. That name will apply to more than one, said the doctor significantly. A very Judas were you, Delilah Craven, to the fair young creature your brother had loved so dearly, and for whom you professed so ardent an affection, her betrayer and murderer. And what if I was? She cried again, making a desperate effort to overcome her agitation and reassume the proud and haughty bearing of one unjustly accused. Had I no provocation in the loss of my inheritance? Did no good motives actuate me? The church teaches that the end sanctifies the means. The property that should have fallen to me was in the hands of heretics who would use it against the true church. If I recovered it, I could not only prevent that mischief, but would have it in my power to do much for her advancement, and I have done so. And if I am a murderess, what is she? She asked, suddenly pointing to Nina, and flashing upon her look so full of hatred and malice that Ernest involuntarily tightened his clasp about the slender waist which his arm still encircled, and Dr. Monteith started and moved nearer to his darling. You need not fear, cried the woman mockingly. I have no concealed weapon, though it may be well for her and for you that I have none, for God knows that my hatred to her is such that I would trample her in the dust, trample the last breath of life out of her body if I could, for has she not robbed me of my son? My heart's idol, the last of my children, the only one that I had left in the wide world to love and care for me, the only one in whose veins flowed one drop of my blood? As she poured out these words with rapid, vehement utterance, her countenance expressed the most intense anguish, and she wrung her hands with a gesture of bitter grief and despair. Yes, he is dead, 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 she wailed. My boy, my Wilfred, my only son, the jewel of my heart, the light of my eyes, dead, dead, and mouldering beneath the sod. And she has done it. May the bitter blasting curse of a broken-hearted mother follow her to her life's end and into the very grave itself. Utter bewilderment and unfeigned astonishment sat on the face of each of her auditors. Nina had grown deathly pale, and clinging convulsively about her brother's neck. What can she mean? She murmured. How can I have done such a deed? I who never even knew that she had a son. How? How? Cried the woman fiercely. How? Did not your hand strike the blow that forever robbed those glorious eyes of sight? Did not weeks of untold agony follow, and the terrible inflammation bring on the wasting fever that laid him in his grave? A light broke upon the minds of her hearers. Nina still clung to her brother, still kept her face hidden on his shoulder, but she breathed more freely. True, it was a horrible thought that she had caused the death of a human creature, and one who, in all probability, was ill prepared to stand in the presence of his judge, but it had been done in lawful self-defence, and his blood must rest on his own head. It was Dr. Monteith who replied, I am sorry for your loss and your grief. Yet Wilfred's death was but the just retribution for his own and his mother's crimes. And do you not see how your own words are adding fresh links to the chain of evidence against you? If it was your son who seized the bridle of my daughter's pony on the high road, does not that furnish strong presumptive proof that you were concerned in the attempted abduction? And I have recognized you. The moment you entered the room, I recognized you as the woman who has haunted me all my life, said Nina for the first time, addressing Mrs. Craven. Father, it was she who threw the opiate into my drink that night, she who met me in the woods in the guise of the gypsy fortune teller, she who stood at the library window, peering at me through the darkness of her evil eyes, so full of hatred and revenge. I knew it, he said. I have felt sure of it ever since I heard Judy Flanagan's confession. Doubtless she was ignorant of some of this woman's evil deeds, but she told me that the anonymous note conveyed to you so mysteriously was written by Mrs. Craven and carried to you by her own grandson. And Mary Haggerty, too, has confessed that for years you have kept her in your pay to watch my daughter and keep you informed of her whereabouts, he added, again addressing Mrs. Craven. I have also found the man who conveyed you in his wagon from the cottage then occupied by Judy to a spot within sight of Mr. Clemmens' farmhouse, and who, unknown to you and probably unsuspected by you, watched you until you had entered the gate with the babe still in your arms. So you perceive there is not a link missing in the chain of evidence against you. Judy's confession revealing your plot and how it was carried out in the attempt to cause an accident to my carriage and horses, and the frightening of my wife into convulsions by the false report that I was injured. Also the fact for the birth of twins, one living and the other dead. Your conveying away of the former of the two, and in what clothes and ornaments she herself had arrayed it. Then the man's evidence as to where he set you down. After that, the testimony of several persons concerning the discovery of the child a few moments later on that very doorstep, and her adoption by Mr. and Mrs. Clemmens. Mrs. Powell's story of the imparting of the secret to her by her dying sister, and the little bundle of clothing, corresponding to Judy's description of what the child had on when you conveyed it away, kept by Mrs. Powell until 3 days ago, when it came to my possession. And besides all this, Nina's own recollections of you having haunted her all her life. Mary Haggerty's testimony that, hired by you for the purpose, she had watched the child from place to place. And lastly, the several attempts you yourself have made by force or fraud to rob me a second time of my child. Pray, what did you intend to do with her had you succeeded? Consign her to a convent whence she could never have escaped, answered the woman, with another flashing glance of hatred directed at Nina out of her fierce black eyes. And but for the terrible sufferings of Wilfred, I would have tried again and again, till success must have crowned my persevering efforts. And this, too, you would excuse by the teachings of your church? He asked bitterly with a look of stern indignation. Yes, the end sanctifies the means. I would have prevented a marriage with her brother, which I feared would come about. I would have forced her into the true church, thus saving her soul by the destruction of her earthly happiness, and it would have been a good and pious deed. Thank God, our convents are not open to the inspection of the officers of the law, or to the curious prying eyes of the public, well kept at bay by thick stone walls and iron gates and bars, and your petted darling, once safe behind them, you would never have been able to discover her hiding place, and we would have taken our own means for her forcible conversion. I can never forgive myself for the insane folly that kept me from putting her there in the first place, and thus forever effectually concealing her very existence from you. She poured out these words in the mad fury of utter despair, for she saw that she was entirely in the power of him whom she had so deeply wronged. There was no escape from the dire consequences of her now discovered crimes, and having thus given full vent to the rage and hatred that were consuming her, had but no longer power to harm those against whom they were directed. She sank down into the low, cushioned chair behind her, crouching and cowering like one who expects a mortal blow. "And this is what you call the religion of Christ?" said Dr. Monteith with slow, distinct utterance. "This doing evil that good may come? Nay, it is utterly opposed to his teachings and his spirit." She made no reply, nor so much as raised her head or moved from her crouching posture. She seemed like one completely crushed by terror and despair. Ernest had drawn his sister to a seat upon the sofa, and their father paced slowly to and fro across the spacious apartment, in which for some moments a death-like silence reigned. It was broken at length by the wretched culprit. "Wreak your vengeance upon me, Ernest Monteith," she said in accents of sullen despair. hurl the hot thunderbolts of your wrath, just as you no doubt deem it, at my devoted head. I am weary of waiting for them. Let them come, that I may know the worst. I can scarce suffer more in the future than I have in the past. The long dreary months that I have spent in mourning over the untimely death of him who was my all. Do your worst. You can add but little to the woes that are already crushing me to the earth, sinking me to the grave. This house has been a prison since he died. The wealth that I risked so much to secure, far more for him than for myself, is worthless to me now. So do your worst." He came and stood before her, speaking in the calm, quiet tone that, with him, expressed intensity of emotion, restrained by a strong and resolute will. "I desire not to add to the woes which I see are already more than you can bear, for I had been praying God for grace to forgive as I would be forgiven, to forgive the wrongs to wife and children, tenfold bitterer to me than my own. The true religion of Christ is one of forgiveness, forbearance, and love. I have therefore no revenge to take. Confession and restitution, so far as it lies in your power, are all that I require. And why a confession? You cannot absolve me from guilt, and you have already proof enough. I acknowledge that I owe these to be your children and Nina's. Is not that sufficient? No, I require a written confession of your crimes against my wife and children, and an acknowledgment of the identity of the latter, signed by your own hand, and I want it at once." "You are cruel. I could not hold a pen at this moment, and to write out such a paper as you demand would be utterly impossible." "It may be written by another at your dictation. I am in momentary expectation of the arrival of my solicitor, who may choose to act as your amanuensis. If he does not, my son will do you that service. Shall I ring for writing materials, or shall we adjourn to the library?" "As you please. You are now master here." "Then we will go there," he said, offering her the support of his arm. But she rejected it, and though trembling so violently as to be obliged to steady herself by the furniture and the walls several times ere the short journey was accomplished. Ernest and Nina looked about them with eager curiosity as they followed their father and Mrs. Craven down the wide entrance hall and into the library, a large, luxuriously furnished apartment, its walls lined with well-filled bookcases and cabinets of curiosities, and its windows commanding a magnificent view of mountain and river. In the embrasure of one of these, on a softly cushioned divan, the two placed themselves side by side. "Let us sit here and enjoy this glorious prospect," said Ernest. "I suppose that it is not necessary that we should hear the repetition of that woman's confession of her evil deeds. And here we are out of earshot, yet near enough to be summoned if we are wanted." The blinds of all the other windows were partly closed, admitting only a subdued light and leaving the greater part of the room in shadow. Mrs. Craven had sought out its darkest corner, and, sinking back into the depths of a large easy chair, turned her face from the light. Dr. Monteith paced to and fro for a moment, his mournful eyes taking in one after another each old familiar object, for the room had not been refurnished or altered in any way since the death of its former mistress, and memory recalled many a little scene there enacted in which she, the loved and lost, had borne a part. "Look at father," whispered Nina. "I think I never saw his dear, kind, noble face so pale and sorrowful." "And no wonder," urged Ernest in the same low tone. "How everything here must remind him of her, our dear young mother, of her and of her sad fate." The doorbell rang as he spoke, and the next moment a servant appeared announcing the arrival of another gentleman, and asking, "Shall I bring him in here?" "Yes," said Dr. Monteith. The man stared and glanced at Mrs. Craven, as much as to say he expected his orders from her. But she neither moved nor spoke, and Dr. Monteith repeated in an authoritative tone, "Show him in here at once." The servant retreated, muttering sullenly to himself, and presently returned, ushering in an elderly gentleman of legal aspect, whom he announced as Mr. Tibbet from Philadelphia. Dr. Monteith stepped forward, and the two shook hands and exchanged a few words in an undertone. Then Mr. Tibbet bowed stiffly to Mrs. Craven, with more affability to the young lady and gentleman, and drawing up a chair to a table furnished with writing materials, seated himself with a business air that seemed to say, "We must go to work at once. I have not a moment to spare." All eyes were turned upon Mrs. Craven, but hers determinately sought the carpet, while her lips were firmly compressed, and her face was white and rigid. Madam, said the lawyer, you cannot fail to see that the doctor has you entirely in his power. Better make a virtue of necessity, and let us have a full and free confession at once, beginning, if you please, with the transaction between yourself and a certain woman of the lower class, in which you exchanged the little Ernest, Dr. Monteith's living son, for the dead child of another. As he spoke, he spread a sheet of paper on the table before him, selected a pen, and dipped it in ink. She neither lifted her eyes nor changed her attitude in the least, but began at once, and in a low, hard, unwilling tone, repeated the story of fraud and crime already familiar to our readers. She told it briefly, and without any sign of emotion, coldly, hardly, as if she were telling of the guilt of another, in which she had had no share. When she finished, the lawyer read to her what he had written, asking if it was all correct. She said it was. Martin and the housekeeper were then called in. Mrs. Craven signed the paper in their presence, and they added their signatures as witnesses. They retired, exchanging wondering glances and whispered questions, which neither was able to answer. Something quite out of the common is going on, that's certain, remarked the housekeeper, and it's plain that she's in sore trouble too. But dear me, we needn't care. If one of us was to drop down dead, it would hardly cost her a second thought. Hark, what's going on at that side door? I must see to it. She hurried away while Martin walked majestically upstairs, much too dignified to indulge in curiosity regarding servants' squabbles. At the side entrance, a bright-looking, neatly dressed mulatto girl with a lad of the same colour and a darker-hued, middle-aged woman at her back was claiming admittance, which Patrick seemed much inclined to refuse. "What's wrong, Patrick? What do you wish, miss?" asked the housekeeper, drawing near. The girl dropped a curtsy. "If you please, ma'am, I'm Rose Johnson, Miss Monteith's maid, and these," turning to her companions, "is my brother Dolph and old Willett Smith, that the doctor disengaged for cook, and ordered us to come on in the pursuing train, which we've done. And now this sassy Irish fellow don't want to let us in." "But really, I don't understand what your doctors or your young lady servants are doing here," returned the housekeeper with a look of surprise. "'Cause it's the doctor's house," cried Rose impetuously. "Your Mrs. Craven, she got it by cheating and lying, and carrying off the doctor's children, and saying they was dead when they wasn't. But now it's all found out on her, and she's got to give up, and maybe go to jail too. Though the doctor's so good, I don't believe he'll send her there, bad as she deserves it." Unbounded astonishment sat on the face of each listener. They fell back, and the newcomers passed in and made themselves at home without further trouble. Meanwhile, Lawyer Tibbet was giving his undivided attention to the weightier matters under consideration in the library. Mrs. Craven had delivered up the keys, including those of the secretary, contained the private papers of the late Mr. Delacourt, and the three gentlemen were busied in the examination of the will, certificates of stocks, bonds, mortgages, deeds, etc., etc. "All right, nothing missing, everything just as it was when we resigned the property to Mrs. Craven," exclaimed the lawyer at length, rubbing his hands together with an air of great satisfaction. "I congratulate you, madam, on the aptitude for business you have shown in your management of the estate. You have spent nothing but the income, I see, but that is very large, and you had no right to it. You ought to refund. The doctor here might compel you to do so." "No, he could not, for I am nearly penniless," she answered, with a cold, bitter look of defiance. "My brother's annuity, a petty 600 a year, is all I have left, and as I have now no living heir, that too reverts to his children at my death. My unnatural brother left me no power to will it away, else they would never touch a penny of it, and it will be but a drop in the ocean of the wealth of the owner of Avonmore and Wold," she added, fairly gnashing her teeth with rage at the thought. "Mr. Delacourt's sister shall not suffer from want while it is in my power to supply her need," said Dr. Monteith. "I accept no favours from my enemies, Ernest Monteith," she interrupted fiercely, "and a home is already provided for me. I shall retire at once to a convent, and there spend my few remaining days. Have you now done with heaping humiliations and reproaches upon me? If so, I will leave this house this hour, this moment, never to set foot in it again." She rose and stood erect, steadying her trembling form by grasping the back of a chair, while once more she sent a flashing glance of impotent rage and hate from one face to another of the little group before her. Ernest and Nina had come forward to the table. The fair girl shuddered and clung to her father's arm. "Fear nothing, darling. he whispered in her ear. Then turning to Mrs. Craven, "You are not going on foot?" he said. "You are scarcely able to stand, and you have had no dinner. Wait, and let me order some refreshment for you and the carriage, that you may go away as comfortably as possible." "Dinner! It would choke me," she cried passionately. "Touch a morsel of food belonging to you, set foot in your carriage, Ernest Monteith? Never while I live. I would sooner drop down and die in the road. And what matter if I should? Who is there to mourn my loss, or shed one tear over my dead body?" The tone of the last words was indescribably bitter and hopeless, and waving them angrily from her path, she swept out of the room, passion and strong will for the moment supplying the lack of strength. But Dr. Monteith stepped quickly after her. "Listen one moment, Mrs. Craven," he said. "Let me go," she cried, again angrily waving him aside. "What more would you with me? Am I not already sufficiently humiliated? Is there aught more for you to strip me of?" "I will not insult you with further offers of anything you might deem a favor," he answered. "But as a physician, allow me to warn you against exposing yourself, in your present mental and physical condition, to the rays of this burning July sun. The hired hack which brought Mr. Tibbet is still here. Take it, and I will see that he is supplied with another conveyance. I tell you I will walk. My own 2 feet shall carry me away from this my lawful inheritance, of which you have robbed me," she cried in the same fierce tone as before, and glaring on him like a tigress at bay. At the sound of the opening of the library door, the servants had all come flocking into the hall, and even Martin was already halfway down the stairs, dignity well nigh forgotten in overpowering curiosity. "Pack my trunks instantly, Martin, and follow me with them to the American house in the village," commanded her mistress, turning haughtily to her. "Yes, madame," replied the maid. "But you are not going to walk there through this burning hot sun?" "It is your place neither to question nor to dictate," returned her mistress more haughtily than before. "Bring me my bonnet and sunshade, and keep your advice till it is asked for." A fierce sweeping glance of the fiery eyes seemed to direct the latter clause of the sentence to all present, and no one offered any further remonstrance. They stood in silence there till Martin came running down with the required articles, tied on the bonnet, adjusted the heavy crape veil over the ghastly face, and put the sunshade into the shaking hand. Mrs. Craven had braced herself against the wall while waiting. Martin offered the support of her arm and assisted the tottering steps as far as the gate that opened from the grounds of Avonmore upon the high road leading to the nearest village. As she returned to the house, passing round to the side entrance by which Rose and her companions had been admitted, Dr. Monteith was giving orders to the hackman who had brought them to follow Mrs. Craven, just keeping within sight of her, and holding himself in readiness to give her any needed assistance. Martin looked up into his face. It struck her as noble and kindly in features and expression, and she paused, half resolved to ask of him an explanation of all these sudden and surprising occurrences. But on second thought she refrained, merely bowed respectfully, and passing in at the open door, hurried upstairs to the suite of apartments till now occupied by Mrs. Craven, where she busied herself in obeying the order to pack up her effects for removal. "What's it all about, I wonder?" muttered the old maid, moving rapidly back and forth between closets and trunks. "Robbed of her lawful inheritance, eh? I'd like to know how they managed that, for it was never an easy task to outwit her." The door opened, and the housekeeper entered, hastily closing it after her. "Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Martin, I forgot to knock," she said, as the latter looked round in surprise. "But it's no wonder, considering how flustered I am with all that's going on in this house. It's changed owners, and Mrs. Craven will never darken its doors again. There, what do you think of that?" "I thought so. But do tell me all about it, all you know at least." The housekeeper replied by repeating Rose's story, winding up with the added information that Dr. Monteith had already paid off and dismissed all the old servants, including herself, and that she should leave the premises within the hour. "On foot?" asked Martin. "No, not I. He's behaving like a real gentleman. Says he'll send me and my trunks to the village along with you and Mrs. Craven's luggage. So I'm off to do my packing." And she left the room as hastily as she entered. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 48. Retrospection. Rose and Violet had taken gleeful possession of the large roomy kitchen, and a good dinner was in course of rapid preparation there, while Mr. Tibbet busied himself in the library with the rearrangement of the Delacourt papers, and the doctor, Ernest, and Nina wandered from room to room of the spacious mansion, the father finding a mournful pleasure in pointing out to his children each spot made sacred to him by the former presence of their mother, his idolized wife. They lingered long in the room where she had breathed her last. There had been little or no change in the furniture or its disposal, and at the moment of their entrance, Dr. Monteith seemed well nigh overpowered by the sudden rush of sad recollections called forth by its familiar aspect. Nina was leaning on his arm. He led her to a sofa and signed to Ernest to seat himself on the other side. Then, taking a hand of each, he described to them in low, tremulous tones the scenes and incidents of that eventful day when Nina's eyes had first opened to the light and her mother's closed to it forever on earth. The three mingled their sighs and tears together, and never before had they seemed so near and dear to each other. "Dearest father, how my heart aches to think how desolate you must have felt that day," whispered Nina, leaning her head upon his breast. "I was indeed," he said, passing an arm about her waist, "for I had lost my heart's choicest treasure, and knew not that two darling children were still spared to me. Had I known it, the blow caused by your beloved mother's death, terrible as it was, and must have been under any circumstances, would not have fallen upon me with such crushing weight." A solemn hush fell on the little group. The spirit of the sainted wife and mother seemed almost sensibly present with them. For some moments they neither moved nor spoke, and Nina almost held her breath, listening for the silent footfalls, waiting for the soft touch of her mother's hand or lip upon her brow. But presently her father rose and led them from the room. The grounds of Avonmore were scarcely equal in extent to those of Wold, but the house was even larger, and showed a more lavish expenditure of means. It was a palace-like dwelling, and nothing had been spared that fine artistic taste, joined to abundant wealth, could do to render it luxurious and attractive. There was a gallery of fine old paintings, many of them gems of art and almost priceless worth, and fine statues and pictures, and costly ornaments adorned nearly every room. The lawns, shrubbery, and gardens were laid out with exquisite taste, and the hot houses and conservatories were filled with rare exotic fruits and flowers. The young people were charmed with all they saw, and but for two things, the consciousness that to her beloved father sad memories clung about all these scenes, and the remembrance of the hate and malice in Mrs. Craven's eyes, Nina would have been in really wild spirits. As it was, she seemed full of gaiety and mirth, now and then tempered by a shade of sadness, the reflection of the passing expression of her dear parent's face. True, the thought of her rejected lover on his way to distant shores would occasionally intrude to damp her joy, but she soon banished it with the determination to believe that he would return ere long and again sue for her hand. And if he did not, well, she would tear his image from her heart. Even that should not be impossible to a will so strong and determined as hers. "What a lovely, delightful place this is!" she cried, as with her father and brother she looked out from the drawing-room window upon the broad river, darkening with the shadows of the coming night, and the wooded hilltops still warm with the light of the setting sun. "Father, can't we send for Aunt Lettuce and Lily, and just spend the summer here, all of us together?" "Perhaps so," he answered, "only I must return for a time on account of some of my patients. Indeed, I am not quite certain that I ought to leave them at all for more than a few days I expected to be absent when we left Wold." Ernest was beginning affectionately to urge his need of rest when they were interrupted by the entrance of Adolphus with the startling announcement that Mrs. Craven was lying very ill at the village inn, and thought to be in a dying condition, and had sent a messenger with an earnest entreaty that Dr. Monteith would come to her with all speed. Lena would have had her father refuse to obey the summons, seeing in it only a new effort of their relentless foe to wreak her vengeance upon him. Her imagination drew terrible pictures of highwaymen and deadly assassins lying in ambush by the roadside, ready to spring out upon him as he passed and rob him of his precious life. But he assured her that her fears were groundless, that he knew the messenger to be an honest, trustworthy man, and that he felt it his duty to go. Yet to please her, he agreed to take Adolphus with him. "Don't sit up for me, as there is no telling when I shall return," he added, as he bade them good-bye. "And, Ernest, take care of your sister, sleep in adjoining rooms, and let Rose, too, be close at hand." End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 49. Retribution. Mrs. Craven was on the downhill of life, upwards of 60 years of age. She had fretted herself into bad health since the death of her son, refusing to go out for necessary air and exercise, and for the most part keeping the sweet light of heaven excluded from her apartments, and leading as gloomy and secluded an existence as that of a cloistered nun. The terrible excitement of that day, followed by the unusual fatigue of a long walk, exposed to the direct rays of a burning summer sun, had well nigh completed the work of destruction, and on reaching the village inn she had found herself so ill as to be forced to take to her bed, and that with the feeling that she was never to rise from it again. She had talked of weariness of life and of longing to lay down its burdens and rest in the grave, but now that death was really staring her in the face, her sins rose up before her, and she grew wild with terror and despair. She knew that Dr. Monteith was reckoned a skilful physician, and there was no other within many miles in whom she had any confidence. Therefore, and because she thought his forgiveness for her crimes against him and his would alleviate in some measure the sharp stings of an awakened conscience, she had begged that he might be sent for without delay. The glow of the sunset had quite faded from the western sky. The hills loomed up darkly on every side, and the stars were coming out one by one, as the doctor and his companions, Adolphus and the messenger from the inn, set out on a rapid walk from Avonmore to the village. The landlord met them at the tavern door, evidently full of curiosity. "Ah, doctor, how do you do? Glad to see you. Haven't had the pleasure of seeing you in these parts for a long while. Mrs. Craven's very bad, poor woman. Can't think what brought her here, but she's very bad, and in a terrible way, because there's no priest at hand." "Is there not one residing in the village?" asked the doctor. "Yes, but he's absent at present, and the only other one within 20 miles is down sick." "Where shall I find Mrs. Craven?" "This way, sir, if you please." Annie hurried forward, mounting the stairs to the first floor, and conducted the physician to a rather small room, plainly but very comfortably furnished, and beautifully neat and clean. A shaded lamp burned on a stand in one corner, and beside it in an armchair sat Martin, looking grave and solemn, while her mistress lay tossing and moaning on the bed, her fierce black eyes looking larger and blacker and fiercer than ever, in contrast to the pale, sunken, hollow cheeks. "I thought you would never come," she cried, starting up with a wild look as Dr. Monteith entered. "You and the man that was sent to bring you must have crept along like snails. I wonder you were not in greater haste to hear what further confessions death could wring from Delilah Craven. Ha, ha, he's come, and I'm not so glad of it as I thought I should be. Ernest Monteith," and she clasped his arm with a death-like grip as he drew near and laid his finger on her pulse. "Ernest Monteith, they say you have such skill as could all but raise the dead. Keep me alive till morning, till I can get a priest here to absolve me from my sins and administer the last rites of the church." Her hand loosened its hold, and she fell back, grasping for breath. "Mrs. Craven," he said, leaning over her and speaking in low tones of intense earnestness, "look to that priest who is ever near, ever ready to listen to the cry of the returning penitent, and who is able to save to the utmost. Don't waste time in talk," she cried, again starting up, but only to fall back again with a bitter groan. "I'm dying, don't you see it? Give me something to keep life in me till I can have the last rites of my church and die in peace." "It is not in my power," he said. "You have spoken truly. Death is here, and no mortal hand may stay his uplifted dart." "Ah, you will not try?" she shrieked. "Where now is your boasted religion that teaches you to return good for evil? I have but robbed you for a few years of wealth which was more mine than yours, and of the company of wife and children, and for this you would rob me of my soul? Curse you, and you may die in agony 10 times greater than mine." "You misjudge me," he said with much emotion. "God knows I would grant your request if it were possible, that I would make any effort to save you, especially to secure your soul's salvation. But I know that you have not an hour to live, and that Jesus Christ alone is able to save you from eternal death, and I entreat you to flee at once to him." "There is no salvation out of the true church," she muttered, "and why after all should I so dread death? Have I not done much to purchase heaven? Look here." And tearing open the bosom of her night dress, she showed him that she wore underneath it a garment of coarse haircloth, which must have kept up a constant irritation of the skin. Then opening it in turn, she displayed beneath it a cross with sharp edges that had cut and worn into the flesh, making a frightful sore. "And that is not all," she said with a ghastly smile, as he turned away with a look of pained, sorrowful disgust. "Since my son died, I have fasted 2 days out of every week, fasted from everything but bread and water, partaking but sparingly of them, and never, never have I been guilty of allowing the smallest morsel of meat to pass my lips on Friday, and I have for very many years rigidly observed every fast and feast of the church. Ah, if I could but live to receive her last rites, all could not fail to be well. Ernest Monteith, you shall keep me from dying till this can be accomplished." As she spoke, she glared at him with her fierce, malignant eyes, over which the film of death was already gathering, and with her dying fingers again clutched madly at his arm. "Oh, that I could prolong your life, if but for a single hour, that you might have some short space for repentance," he groaned, deeply moved. "Oh, ask help of him who alone can give it. Cease trusting in the filthy rags of your own righteousness, and plead to be washed from your sins in his atoning blood. Ah, you will not save me. Your hatred pursues me to the grave. Curse you, she muttered. Her fingers fell from his arm. A look of wild terror and despair passed over her face. She gasped once, twice, and was gone. Martin fell down upon her knees, hiding her face and shuddering from head to foot, while Dr. Monteith turned away with a heavy sigh and such a feeling of sickening horror as he had never known before, though he had stood by hundreds of deathbeds, and yet he did not fear, indeed scarcely thought of, the curses she had heaped upon his head. The following day the Monteiths left Avonmore for Wold, but returned a week later, bringing Aunt Lettice and Lily with them. The ladies remained during the summer and early autumn months, the two physicians coming and going as business or pleasure dictated. There was no lack of the best society. Old friends and new hastened to welcome them to the neighborhood and to offer congratulations on the recovery of the property of which they had been so long unjustly deprived. Nor were admirers wanting to the heiress of Avonmore and her friend. Lily was circumspect and gave Ernest no cause for complaint. But had Marchant been there, his jealousy need not have died out for want of fuel to feed its flame. Yet Nina, smiling graciously upon all alike, really tried to give undue encouragement to none. The last of October found them all together at Wold, occupied with the old duties and the old pleasures. They mingled more in general society than formerly, Nina and Lily having quite arrived at the dignity of young ladyhood. But their pleasures were principally of the quiet kind. The girls were almost inseparable during the day, the greater part of which was usually spent with Aunt Lettice, while the gentlemen were busied with the duties of their profession. But in the evening, when no company was present, the lovers were apt to be completely absorbed in each other, as lovers will, and Aunt Lettice to drop asleep in her chair. Then Nina devoted herself to her father, who was never weary of her society. Her sweetest songs, her finest performances on the piano and harp were for him, and she valued praise from no other source so highly. They enjoyed many a book together, he reading aloud to her while she worked, or if very weary, leaning back in his cushioned chair while she read to him. Nina seemed very happy, and indeed she was, except now and then when she could not banish the thought of Marchant and the growing fear that all was over between them. She tried to forget him and to believe that she had never loved him, and it was seldom she indulged her hungry heart with so much as a glance at the long closely written letters received from him by her father and Ernest. Yet not unfrequently they were read aloud in the family circle, and she dared not run away for fear of exciting remark and suspicion of the true state of affairs between her and the writer. She was obliged to sit still and listen, while they, with their lively detail of incidents of travel and graphic descriptions of scenery and people, sometimes beautiful and charming ladies, his own countrywomen or natives of the land he was visiting, perhaps did more than his presence might have done to keep bright his image in her heart and make it grow dearer than before. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Wanted a Pedigree. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi Huck. Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley. Chapter 50. Sowing and Reaping. It was the middle of July, the very height of the bathing season, and several successive days of unusually hot weather, even for that time of the year, had filled the hotels and boarding houses of Cape May to overflowing. In the great dining hall of the Columbia House, a hop was in full progress, and most of the guests were gathered there, either as participants or spectators of the gay and lively scene. Yet there were some, and they were not a few, who thought the strains of music discoursed by the band pleasantly mellowed by the distance that lay between the house and the plank walk, which for several squares ran parallel with the beach, and a moonlight promenade in the fresh sea breeze, in full sight of the rolling, dashing waves, greatly to be preferred to the hot, close atmosphere of the ballroom. Among these last was a gentleman with a lady upon each arm, both young and lovely, but the beauty of the one in singular and striking contrast to that of the other. The one small, slight, delicate, and fragile in appearance, with golden hair, violet eyes, and a complexion of pearly whiteness, with just the faintest tinge of rose color in each softly rounded cheek. The other rather above the medium height, with a form of exquisite proportion, abundance of raven hair, starry, glorious eyes, black as midnight, eyes that could flash with anger, melt in tenderness, or sparkle with fun. A face oval in form and perfect in outline, a Greek profile, a rich, creamy complexion, soft and beautiful as that of an infant, and cheeks blooming as the rose. A face and form that once seen could never be forgotten. "How delicious this is!" she exclaimed, drawing a long, deep breath. "This breeze and the sea, the glorious sea with the moonlight dancing on the waves. I feel so gay tonight, so full of life and spirits that I half wish I were a child again, that I might run, hop, skip, and jump without fear of horrifying any chance beholder." "If you were a child you would probably be in bed at this hour," remarked the other lady with a slight laugh. "It cannot be far from 9, I think." "Are you growing weary, Lily? Are we fatiguing you too much?" asked the gentleman, bending a tender, anxious look upon her sweet, fair face. "Oh, no, I am not at all fatigued," she answered, smiling brightly up at him. "I am growing so strong and well. I seem to inhale new life with every breath of this delightful bracing air. Yes, you have improved wonderfully in the week that we have been here, but we must not try your newfound strength too far. Here are some seats. Let us rest upon them a little while. We must have been walking for at least half an hour. They sat down, the taller lady dropping the gentleman's arm and drawing a little apart from him and the one he had called Lily. The two were evidently lovers and seemed mostly wholly engrossed with each other. She looked at them for a moment, a sweet and beautiful smile playing about her lips, then rose and paced slowly back and forth. Presently a gentleman came up, bowed, and entered into conversation, then another and another, till quite a little group of admirers had gathered about her. Her wondrous beauty, her wit and vivacity, and the charming navette and sweetness of her manners made her list of such a long one wherever she went, while doubtless her reputed wealth was not calculated to reduce their number. "I have been looking for you in the ballroom, Miss Monteith," said one. "I had hoped to have the pleasure of dancing at least one set with you." "I do not dance," she answered, "and greatly prefer the cool breeze and charming moonlight to the close air of the ballroom and the heat and glare of its artificial light. Certainly, they are more agreeable and healthful. But do you really mean to say that you never dance?" "Never. I do not even know how." "It is an accomplishment very easily acquired by an intelligent person, whose movements are naturally graceful," he said with a meaningful bow and smile, "and I am sure Miss Monteith would not find it in the least difficult." "I have no desire to try," she answered a little disdainfully. "You would find it a delightful pastime, I do assure you." "Possibly, yet I repeat that I have no wish to try it. Conscientious scruples, eh? None, except as my father's wishes are concerned, but they are law to me." "You are rather unfashionable in your sentiments and conduct in regard to this matter," remarked another of the gentlemen. "There are few young ladies of the present day, none that I am acquainted with, who are so ready to be guided by the opinions or wishes of their fathers." "I believe that is true," she answered, "though I am sorry to have to acknowledge it. But perhaps the fault is not entirely with the daughters. I think there are few fathers like mine. My own dear father," she murmured, half under her breath, and the look of tender, loving reverence that came over her face was beautiful to see. But it vanished on the instant. She started, flushed crimson, and covering her momentary confusion by a light jesting remark about the bathing that day and the sport they had had in the water, turned her face seaward. What was it that had set her heart to beating so wildly that she almost feared her companions would hear it above the strains of music and the dashing of the waves? A gentleman had passed with a lady on his arm. For one instant Nina had seen his face, had heard the tones of his voice, a face and voice that she could not mistake, though she had not heard the one or seen the other for more than a year, and the moment before had believed the owner far beyond those rolling billows, wandering on a foreign shore. She ventured presently to send a stealthy glance after the pair, while still keeping up her lively chat with those around her. They were already nearly out of sight. She could barely discern the outlines of their forms in the distance, but it seemed to her that the lady's was slight and graceful, and that he was bending over her in lover-like fashion. Why did the sight send such a quick, sharp pang to her heart? Could it be that she still cared so much for Marchand de Vere, she who was surrounded by troops of admirers wherever she went? No, she did not, would not care for him. And she would not let him see that she did not, for had he not allowed a whole year to pass without another effort to win her hand? True, she had rejected him most scornfully, but love that was so easily vanquished was not worth the having. Yet while she was carrying on a spirited conversation with those about her, she continually caught herself intently listening for the sound of his returning footsteps, and now and then glancing in the direction in which he had gone. Nor had she long to wait, though to her impatience the minutes seemed like hours, ere the two came sauntering back. How her heart beat again! How carefully she kept her face turned towards the sea, away from the path he was following! How her ear was strained to catch the sound of his voice or foot! "Ernest, my dear fellow! And Lily, too! Excuse me, Miss Donaldson," she heard him exclaim in joyous tones. "I did not know that you were here. How delightful to meet you!" Then there was Ernest's hearty, "Why, Marchant, old fellow, is it you? Where did you come from? This is the greatest and most delightful surprise." And Lily's, "Marchant de Vere, we all thought you were still in Europe." Then introductions were exchanged, followed by the question, "And how are my uncle and aunt Lettice? And your sister? All well, I hope?" "All quite well, I thank you, and will be delighted to hear of your return. You must go home with us, of course, but Nina is here to speak for herself." "Nina?" She paid no heed to the call, but went on with her lively chat. "Where is she? Is that she?" Marchant's voice was eager in its tones. He had seated his companion, Miss Carrington, by Lily's side, and with quick, impulsive step he hastened in the direction of the little group of which Nina was the centre. Her face was toward him now. She looked up. Their eyes met. "Miss Monteith." His hand was extended eagerly, and his eyes looked beseechingly into hers. She gave him the tips of her gloved fingers, and with a stiff formal, "How do you do, Mr. de Vere?" drew coldly back. His eyes flashed. He bowed a haughty good evening, and turned away without another word. Nina had never been more angry with herself, and a fierce jealousy toward Miss Carrington, who she could see even from that distance was a very sweet-looking girl, suddenly sprung up in her heart. She was bitterly angry with her, with Marchant, with herself, and with all the world. Yet was there no outward sign of the tempest raging within? The tones of her voice and her low musical laugh were as gay and gladsome as before, her face as bright and sweet. She talked on, exchanging light, jesting remarks and merry repartee with those about her, till Ernest came to ask if she wished to go on, saying Lily was very weary and would like to retire, but did not mind going alone if she preferred to remain longer on the beach. "I am quite ready to go," Nina answered cheerfully, and taking her brother's offered arm, she bade her admirers a gay good night. The two girls shared the same room, and Ernest parted with them at the door. "What a delightful surprise this is! Marchant's coming," remarked Lily, beginning her preparations for bed, "and that Miss Carrington is very sweet looking. We shall now be quite a pleasant party by ourselves." "I hate sweet people," cried Nina passionately. "I could never bear them. Those people that look as if butter wouldn't melt in their mouths, and are ready with such a martyr-like air whenever they can't have everything their own way." "Ah, yes, I know what you mean, but I don't think Miss Carrington is of that sort. She looks like the genuine article, and is right pretty too." "Pretty indeed," muttered Nina half angrily and with averted face. "But, my dear child," said Lily, "you were not near enough to judge, and both Ernest and I thought her remarkably pretty, as well as ladylike and agreeable." "But what in the world did you do to Marchant? He seemed so bright and cordial when he first encountered us, really gay and happy, but when he came back from speaking to you he was quite the reverse, looking moody and depressed, and, I thought, found it hard work to talk." "Hard work to talk with that pretty, pretty creature by his side? Is it possible?" So bitter and scornful was Nina's tone that the sweet violet eyes of her friend opened wide with surprise. "Lily, dear, I beg your pardon," cried Nina, suddenly throwing her arms around her and kissing her affectionately, but with glistening eyes. "I am hatefully cross tonight. I don't know what has come over me. No danger of anyone ever disliking me for my sweetness." "Ah, I understand," thought Lily, returning the caress as warmly as it was given. "How blind I have been! The course of true love never did run smooth, except in Ernest's case and mine." Then she said aloud, "No, you have none of that insipid sweetness which, as it seems to me, is the outgrowth and evidence of hypocrisy in some, in others of an indolent self-complacency, faults to which I fear I am far more inclined by natural temperaments than you, and which are far more detestable than the quick temper that seems to belong to an energetic, impulsive nature like yours." "Oh, Lily, don't excuse me or make light of my faults. I would give anything for your sweet patience and serenity, that takes everything so calmly and smoothly." Ah, I am so happy, so very happy, whispered Lily, half hiding her sweet blushing face on Nina's bosom, that I deserve no credit for the qualities you mention. And you, I see, are not happy tonight, she added, looking wistfully up into the beautiful face bending over her. And why should you not be? Think how you are admired and loved, how inexpressibly dear you are to us all, your father, Aunt Lettice, Ernest, and me. A silent caress was the only reply, and Nina, moving away, stood at the window gazing out upon the sea. Are you not coming to bed? Lily asked at length as she laid herself down in it. It is after 11, and so you will get very little beauty sleep, even if you come now. However, you can afford to spare that if anyone can, she added with a light laugh. No, I haven't the least inclination to sleep. I am certain it would be useless to try, and I cannot take my eyes from the sea. I never weary of looking at it, so I shall throw on my dressing gown and sit out here on the balcony for a little while. Then my wakefulness will not disturb you, and as I shall leave the door open and remain close by it, I can hear if you call. Lily was already half asleep, and merely murmured an inarticulate reply as Nina passed out and sat down with her elbow on the railing and her cheek resting on her hand. The hop was still going on, but in a distant part of the building, and the music of the band, as it came softly to her ear, mingled pleasantly with the gentle murmur of the sea. It soothed her almost insensibly, and calmer feelings gradually replaced the fierce anger and jealousy that had agitated her breast for the last hour. The more she thought of it, the more convinced she felt that this Miss Carrington was Marchant's fiancée, and that he was lost to her forever. But she submitted with a sad resignation, comforting herself with the thought of her father's love and how she would cling to him and find her happiness in it as long as they both should live, and how she was glad that she had treated Marchant with such marked coldness that night, though she had at first been so angry with herself for it, for she would not for worlds have him suspect, now that he loved and was to marry another, that she cared in the least for him, or that there was a slightest possibility that he might have won her hand. She did not know how long she had sat there. It might have been an hour, or it might have been more, when suddenly the music ceased, and the noise of the dancers' feet and a confused murmur of voices was heard instead. Then a quick, agitated step on the stairs, and hurrying through the hall, a step so different from what Ernest's ordinarily was that she did not recognize it as his, until he stood pale and trembling at her side. She sprang up with a low cry. What is it? Oh, what is it? What has happened? He caught her to his breast with a convulsive clasp, dropped his head on her shoulder, and strong, brave man as he was, sobbed aloud. Oh, brother, brother, speak, she cried. My father? No, darling, no, not that. Thank God, it is not that, he answered hurriedly, lifting his head and dashing away his tears. But Marchant, our own dear Marchant, is drowned. He was not prepared for the look of wild anguish that came over the face uplifted to his, or the low heart-broken cry that burst from her pale lips as her head dropped lifeless upon his arm. Oh, Ernest, what is it? Asked Lily's voice at his side, for, roused by Nina's first cry of alarm, she had sprung out of bed, and hastily donning dressing gown and slippers, had rushed out to learn the cause. Oh, I have killed her, my precious sister. Oh, how could I know? How could I guess? I never suspected it in the least, groaned Ernest, lifting her in his arms and bearing her into the room, where he laid her gently on a couch before the open window. Lily sprang to the washstand, filled a tumbler with water, and brought it to him. Oh, Ernest, is it anything more than a swoon? She asked fearfully. No, and it will not last long, I hope, he whispered, as he sprinkled the water upon the pale, unconscious face. Oh, my sister, how could I be so thoughtless? But what is it? Asked Lily, trembling and weeping. Oh, Ernest, it is not bad news from home. No, but Marchant, dear brave fellow, his voice was scarcely audible as he went on. A man, some stranger, had imprudently gone in to bathe, got beyond his depth, or perhaps was seized with cramp, and cried out for help. Marchant was pacing the beach, no one very near him, when, hearing the cry, he hastily pulled off his coat and vest, threw them on the ground, and rushed in to the rescue. He never came out. He was an excellent swimmer, but I suppose the drowning man caught hold of him and dragged him under. Oh, Ernest, and did no one try to save him? Lily's voice was choked with sobs. Yes, those that saw him rush in ran for the lifeboat, but it took some little time to launch it, and then the darkness, and well, they had been out an hour or more, beating about in every direction, but without finding the least trace of either. All the time he was speaking, he was using every effort to revive his sister, but for a long while all was in vain, so long that he began to be very seriously alarmed. At last she heaved a deep sigh, opened her eyes, and looked up into his face with a bewildered expression. "Where am I? And what is the matter?" she asked faintly. Then starting up, "Ernest, Ernest, why do you linger here? Why are you not with him?" she cried vehemently. "Who can say that there is not a little spark of life still left? I've read of people being resuscitated after hours of what seemed fruitless effort. Oh, why have you left him? You, his dearest friend, and a physician too. Oh, go, go. If you have any love for me, my brother, leave me and go to him." And she wrung her hands, looking at him with such a beseeching, tearless agony in her beautiful face as almost broke his heart. "Dearest," he said, scarcely able to command his voice, "they have not found." He could go no further. He had thrown his arm around her, and her head sank upon his breast while she clung to him with a death-like grasp, and shudder after shudder shook her whole frame. But for many minutes not a sound escaped her lips. Then at last, "Ernest, Ernest," she moaned, almost under her breath. Is it my work? Did I murder him?" "You, Nina?" he asked with a start of extreme surprise. "Oh, darling, how could that be? No, no, he perished in a noble effort to save another." "Thank God for that," she whispered. But Ernest, my brother, my heart is broken. He loved me once. Oh, how he loved me! But I spurned him, and now, oh, Ernest, if I could only die." "No, darling, don't. Oh, don't say that. Think of our father and all you are to him. His very life is bound up in you. For his sake, dear sister, you must conquer this grief and live. Oh, take me home to him," she moaned. "Take me home, take me home." "Yes, Ernest," whispered Lily, who was weeping bitterly by his side. "Let us go at once. Let us leave by the morning boat." "But you," he said, his first thought ever for her, "you are improving so fast in this bracing air and ought to stay longer. I will come back if you wish, but do let me go with her now." He considered a moment. Ought we not to write first and break the news to them gently? Think what he was to them both, what he has been for years. "I will wait," sighed Nina. "It may be that father will come today, but oh, never ask me to look again at that dreadful, dreadful sea." Ernest pressed her closer to him with a silent caress. "God help you to bear this sorrow, my poor sister," he whispered. There was a silence in the room for a moment. The whole house had grown still, and no sound reached them but the dull, monotonous washing of the waves upon the shore. Nina shuddered as it struck upon her ear. Then, raising herself wearily, "I have been very, very selfish," she said in a dreary tone. "I am keeping you both up, and it must be very late. Do go to bed and try to get some sleep." "If you will do the same," said Ernest tenderly. "Lily, you ought to be there. I fear you will lose all you have gained." And bidding them a kind good night, and receiving a promise that they would retire at once to rest, he went away. As the door closed upon him, Lily threw her arms around Nina, and for a moment or two they remained locked in a close embrace. Then they crept silently into bed. The soft, regular breathing of the one soon told that she slept, but the other never lost consciousness for a moment. How the noise of the waves tortured her! A few hours before the sound had been very pleasant and soothing to her ear, but now were they not rejoicing over their fiendish work, exulting over the destruction of their helpless victim, and greedily clamoring for more? And thought and memory were no less torturing. What would she not have given to recall the past, at least so far as her conduct toward the dead was concerned? Oh, had she but treated him kindly that night, the stings of remorse would not be so very terrible, so almost unendurable. Morning found her with one of the worst attacks of nervous headache, to which all Ernest's skill utterly failed to bring the slightest relief. But it gave her a sufficient excuse for keeping her room, and as she and Marchant had scarcely been seen together, No one but Ernest and Lily had the slightest suspicion of any connection between her sudden illness and the sad accident of the night, which was the principal theme of conversation that day with a large majority of the bathers and promenaders. Ernest and Lily would have remained all day by her bedside, but she begged with almost feverish vehemence to be left to solitude, and they could but yield to her request. They went out together, and she was left alone. Wrapped in a loose dressing gown, she lay on her couch with the curtains drawn before the windows, trying to shut out light and sound. Yesterday so pleasant, today so torturing. The house had grown comparatively still, for it was the bathing hour, and chambers and halls were well nigh deserted when she thought she heard a familiar step approaching her door. It opened softly. She turned her eyes toward it, and with a low, half-smothered cry of mingled joy and anguish, started up, and found herself folded in her father's arms, pressed to her father's beating heart. He held her in a long, close, silent embrace, while her arms were clinging about his neck, and her face lay hidden on his breast. "My darling, my poor darling," he murmured at length, passing his fingers caressingly through her hair, and then at last tears came to the relief of the almost bursting heart, came like a long pent-up flood that suddenly bursts its barriers and with overwhelming force sweeps all before it. He let her weep, only soothing her with her silent tender caresses till the fountain was exhausted, and she lay like a wearied child in his arms. Then he laid her on the couch again and sat down beside her, with one cool hand on her throbbing temples, the other clasping one of hers. He asked no questions, either then or afterwards, for Ernest had met him on his arrival and told him all. The news of Marchant's death was a terrible shock to him, but almost all his heart ached for his beloved daughter, though his surprise on learning how she cared for the lost one was scarcely less than her brother's had been. "Is it possible?" he exclaimed. "I knew that he loved her, but thought she was indifferent to him, for otherwise why should she have rejected his suit, as she tacitly acknowledged to me that she did?" "That I cannot answer," replied Ernest, with a sad shake of the head. "But it is impossible now to doubt that she truly loved him." Nina was very grateful to her father for the silence. The suddenness of the shock, joined to her natural impetuosity and frankness, had revealed her secret to Ernest and Lily. But in the hours of pain and solitude that followed, her woman's pride helped her to regain the command over herself which had been taught her by those hard years with Mrs. Powell, when, having none to sympathize in her joys or sorrows, she had learned to hide them all in her own bosom. Thinking of Miss Carrington as probably Marchant's affianced bride, she said to herself that none must ever guess what he had been to her, that the world must suppose that she mourned him only as a friend who had been almost as a son to her father, a brother to Ernest and herself. And schooling her heart thus, she left the room the next day, and returned home with her father, a little paler, very quiet and subdued in manner, but otherwise appearing much as usual, save an expression of deep, unutterable sadness that in unguarded moments would rest upon her features or look out from the depths of her beautiful eyes. Though Marchant had been long absent from Wall, the house had suddenly grown strangely empty and desolate without him. His presence seemed sorely wanting in every room. In silent anguish, Nina wandered here and there, looking for him, listening for the sound of his step, his voice, his gay ringing laughter. Alas, she could hear them never, never, no never. Oh, the bitterness of that thought! One room still bore his name, Marchant's room everyone called it. Thither Nina bent her steps on the day succeeding that of her return. She thought to find solitude, but Mrs. Barron was there before her, looking over the contents of his trunks, which Dr. Monteith had secured and caused to be sent home. Nina would have retreated, but the old lady, turning her head at the sound of the opening of the door, showing a face all wet with tears, beckoned her to come forward. "It breaks my heart, the dear boy, not one of us forgotten," she sobbed, pointing to a heap of packages that she had laid together on the carpet. "I know how he looked forward to giving them to us, so generous and affectionate as he always was." Nina made no response. She could not speak. Her face grew white and rigid as marble, and her hands were clinched till the nails buried themselves in the soft rosy palm. She leaned against the mantel, looking on in tearless agony, while her old friend proceeded with her task, still talking in low, heartbroken accents. Dear, dear fellow, I can't realize that he won't be coming in and saying as he used whenever he found me going over his things and putting them to rights. Thank you, Aunt Lettice. You are a second mother to me. Oh, to think I'll never hear it again. Never, never. Every word pierced Nina's heart afresh. She would have fled from the room, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. She neither moved nor spoke. No sound came from her lips. Nor sigh heaved her bosom, nor tear gathered in the burning eyes that gazed with such wishful anguish upon each article that had so lately known the touch of his hands, the clothes that he had worn, the books he had read, the pretty and curious things he had collected and brought home as gifts to friends, or mementos of his travels. Among them lay a small volume bound in morocco, with his name on it in gilt letters, a diary. It had been her New Year's gift to him, the first year of their acquaintance, given to a laughing request that it should be returned when full, to which he had rejoined, "Not while I live, but if found among my effects when I am gone, you may claim it." She had entirely forgotten the incident, but as her eye fell upon the hook, the whole scene flashed upon her. Her heart gave a sound. She stooped, caught up the volume and thrust it into her pocket, feeling almost guilty in thus privately possessing herself of it, Mrs. Barron's back being turned at the moment. Yet it was hers of right, and that she could neither resign it to another nor allow any mortal creature to share the secret of its existence. She stole noiselessly from the room, and having gained her own and secured herself against intrusion, drew the book from her pocket. It opened of itself where last his pen had been at work, and glancing down its page, she read what was written there. Liverpool, June 30th, 18. Tomorrow I sail for my native land. I have a gift for each of the dear ones at Wald, a ring for my darling. I cannot help calling her that in my own secret heart, and these pages that no I shall ever look upon but mine. But alas, will she ever give me the right to do so? Ever forgive those cruel, cruel words? It is both beautiful and costly, yet seems but a poor offering to lay at your feet, my peerless one. Oh, will you accept it? Will you permit me to place it upon your finger as the sign and seal of our betrothal? Alas, much I fear you will spurn both it and the giver, and if so, life will be of little worth to me. Your rejected lover. Philadelphia, July 16, 18. At home once more. Again I breathe the same air with her. How my heart throbs at the thought! I long to fly to her this instant, yet shrink from the meeting, lest all my fond hopes be dashed to the ground. Oh, Nina, Nina, how impossible that I should ever resign you to another, or endure life without the hope of winning you. I cannot see her today, for I fear she is absent from Wald, and that one whom I must see at once on urgent business is now at Cape May. The 16th of July, the very day of his death, the day on which she had returned his eager cordial greeting with such marked coldness. How had she wounded that noble loving heart? The book fell from her hand, and, with a low cry of bitter anguish, she threw herself down upon the couch where she had been sitting, and buried her face in its pillows. Oh, had she but treated him kindly even then, all would have been well. He would have told his love, and won from her the acknowledgment that it was returned. He would have then stayed by her side, and, unconscious of the peril of that imprudent bather, would not have risked and lost his precious life in the vain attempt to save another. Oh, the pain, the agony of that thought! And yet there mingled with it a thrill of joy. No other had supplanted her in his affection. His love had been hers, hers only to the very last, and none had a nearer right than she to mourn his loss. She had loved Marchant with all the strength of her strong nature, with a love that she could never give to any other. She was well nigh crushed beneath her load of grief and remorse, yet she must conceal her wound, and she did so effectually that none but her father ever suspected how deep and sore it was. It was only when entirely alone that she allowed her bursting heart to give full vent to all its pent-up anguish, though sometimes, when no one else was by, she would creep to her father's side, and, resting her head on his shoulder, or hiding her pale face on his breast while his arm was folded lovingly about her, she would shed silent tears, tears that she would have permitted no other mortal eyes to see. His sympathy was very sweet and soothing to the sore and aching heart. Dr. Monteith was alone in his office, having just dismissed the last of a dozen or more of poor patients. "For you, sir," said Adolphus, entering, and laying a letter on the table before his master. The boy withdrew. The doctor took up the missive, looked at the address, and a sudden paleness overspread his countenance. He seemed strangely agitated as he broke the seal and glanced hurriedly over the contents. Then he dropped it, to lift hands and eyes to heaven in a fervent thanksgiving. It told a strange tale of extreme peril and wonderful escape, for the writer was none other than Martin Tevere, not as they had believed, lying cold and dead at the bottom of the ocean, but still alive and well. Instead of sinking beneath the waves, he had come in contact with a floating log, which buoyed him up for hours, while he was carried farther and farther out to sea. At length he was seen and picked up in an unconscious and almost dying state by the crew of an outward bound vessel. He received every kindness at their hands, but several days passed ere he was able to give any account of himself, or to notice where he was or who were about him. When he could do so, he learned that they were on the coast of South America, and that the vessel was bound for Rio Janeiro. His letter was dated from that city, where he had been so fortunate as to fall in at once with an old acquaintance, who kindly lent him all the money he required. Having thus reported himself, Marchant went on to tell of his love for Nina, her rejection of his suit, her continued coldness, and his despairing resolve to see her no more till time had healed his wounds and enabled him to overcome his passion. He would not return for years, he said, should travel about in different parts of South America, and probably eventually settle down in one or another of its cities. Dr. Monteith picked up the letter again and gave it a second and more careful perusal. "Foolish children," he murmured with a smile. "I see I shall have to interfere to set them right with each other." And forthwith he wrote a letter that, when received, made Marchant's heart leap for joy. Of course the doctor could not have the heart to keep the good news of the rescue to himself. It was soon made known, and caused great rejoicing in the household, though tempered with regret for the intended long absence of their hero. Nina alone said nothing of that, but she speedily recovered much of her old bloom and brightness, though her father carefully refrained from giving her the smallest hint of what he had done until the time drew near when Marchant might be expected. The warm, ruddy glow of the sunset was just fading out of the sky at the close of a lovely September day, as a young, handsome man alighted from a street car and hurried with rapid step in the direction of Wald. He paused at the gate, and with his hand upon it, looked eagerly across the lawn and up and down the broad green alleys. He started, and his pulses quickened as he caught sight of a solitary female figure slowly pacing to and fro in one of the latter. He could not be mistaken. The queenly form and graceful movements could belong to none other than the peerless daughter of the house. He pushed open the gate, entered, and making a wild circuit among the trees, placed himself behind one within a few feet of her. She continued her walk, and presently passed so near that he could have touched her dress. He heard a gentle sigh. Was she thinking of him? Softly, tenderly, he uttered her name. "Nina." How she started and flushed! What a glad light was in her eyes as she lifted her proud head and sent a searching glance from side to side. "Marchant!" she cried, almost under her breath, but with a tender tremulousness. What a timid yet joyous eagerness in her tones! A sudden rustle, the sound of a quick step on the gravel walk, and Marchant stood before her. He said not a word, but his looks were more eloquent than speech. Their eyes met. He opened his arms, and she never quite knew how it was, but the next moment they had enfolded her, and were straining her to his breast, silently at first, then with whispered words of such deep tenderness, such passionate love, as made her heart to thrill with exquisite happiness. Nothing but death, that severes all earthly ties, should ever part them more. Years have passed since that glad hour, years of such unalloyed felicity, that Nina laughingly asserts that she and Marchant did all their quarrelling before marriage, while Ernest and Lily are evidently reserving theirs for the time when old age shall leave them nothing better to do. May we never live to see that day, ejaculates Ernest, with a loving glance at the sweet face of his little wife. Dr. Monteith cannot bear to be separated from either of his children, and they form one harmonious household, now at Wold and now at Avonmore, of which he is the loved and revered head. Once he looked forward to a lonely and childless old age, but how changed the prospect now! His children delight to do him honour and make his comfort their chief care, while merry rosy-cheeked little ones clamber about his knees, or with joyous shouts of "Grandpa, Grandpa, our dear Grandpa," run to welcome his homecoming. Mrs. Barron is aunt letters to them as to their parents, and she finds it a difficult matter to refrain from spoiling them all with unlimited indulgence. On coming of age, Nina, with her father's cordial approval, deeded the Oakdale property to S.E. Powell. It was left in the care of the trustees, who had been appointed by Mr. Clemmens, until Essie should reach her majority, the income from it in the meanwhile to be used in clothing and educating her. But neither this act of kindness and liberality to her child, nor the generous forbearance exercised towards her husband and herself, could win for Nina a place in Mrs. Powell's regard. On the contrary, she was bitterly angry that the property had not been given into her own possession, and to this day she continues to speak of our heroine as that depraved, ungrateful girl. End of chapter 50. End of Wanted a Pedigree by Martha Finley.